Hello, good evening, and welcome to the stream on the fall of the Soviet Union. Just before I get to this evening's topic, I want to welcome everyone back to streaming. I'm sorry for my hiatus. Unfortunately, I had the flu over Christmas and New Year, so I've been waiting for my voice to recover. Hopefully, I won't be spluttering and coughing my lungs out throughout this entire presentation. One can only hope. But before I begin this lecture discussion, I just want to do a bit of channel housekeeping, if that is okay with everyone. Um, as for a broad trajectory of the stuff that I want to do for the rest of this year, I'm going to be doing a constant series, i.e., every sort of month or so, or perhaps even more frequently, I will be doing a episode from a new series called The Intrusible Chamber. It's something that I wanted to do right from the inception of this channel, and it'll focus more on conceptual history as opposed to these more sort of overarching grand chronological narratives, which I've been doing up until now and indeed encompasses today's episode. So that's one thing. I also want to formalize the structure of doing television and film reviews on this channel. Uh, I partly want to focus on positive things regarding film reviews. I don't want to keep, like with the recent debacle, which I'm sure people on the channel are aware of. I want to focus on positive iterations of historical adaptation, because I am actually quite sparing in some ways to films, and I'm able to overlook certain inconsistencies or certain historical contrivances or omissions if it keeps true to the spirit of history or whatever I choose to cover. So that'll be one aspect. So Intrusible Chamber and AM reviews. Other than that, plenty of other content that'll come on this channel. I had hoped last year to put out a series on Siglo de Oro, the Spanish Golden Age, and perhaps I'll still do that. You know, most of it is written. I'm just not sure about the format in which to present this. So maybe we will see that series towards the end of this year, or hopefully sooner than the end. All right, on to today's topic. I want to start reading a quote from Gorbachev, who I've pictured here in the thumbnail. The reason I selected this thumbnail is that this is a man who looks rather oafish, which I think is rather appropriate given the almost intentionally Homer Simpsonish. This is after the August coup of 1991, or the failed putsch, where he's been essentially completely outmaneuvered both from the old sort of echelons of the quote unquote conservative Soviet hierarchy and by Boris Yeltsin. And this is the quote, and this was on the 28th of November 1990. "There are some things, I call them last stands, that must be defended to the death, as in the battles for Moscow in 1941 and Stalingrad. It is impossible to split us apart," us, of course, referring to the Soviet Union. "We cannot be split apart." Of course, the irony should be obvious to everyone when one considers that within a year, the Soviet Empire will collapse, and on Christmas Day and Boxing Day of 1991, Gorbachev essentially had his office deprived of him because he no longer had a country over which to govern. How am I going to tackle this? Well, obviously, Gorbachev is going to center quite prominently in this overall presentation. But I want to focus on the economy, obviously. Um, Obviously, focusing on the idea of stagnation and the overabundance of, say, for example, Soviet manufacturing and heavy industry, and the materialism, the race between capitalism and communism, which is, you could say, the most obvious route to take this, but it can't be overlooked. And I'm not going to be contrarian enough to ignore that aspect. Then, of course, there is the aspect of nationalism, both in terms of its role in the disintegration of the Soviet Empire, but also in terms of introducing some counterfactuals. And maybe at the end of this lecture, I hope to cover a counterfactual regarding the disintegration of the Soviet Union versus the disintegration of Yugoslavia, and talk about the prospects of the Soviet Union surviving by readapting beyond the narrow confines of Marxism, Leninism, or whatever Gorbachev strove and failed to achieve. So that would be one particular aspect. And the economic argument also bleeds into that, because what the Soviet Union had, in a sense, was economic autarky, which helped preserve their sclerotic and bizarre, overly controlled economic system. But the central focus of this presentation really is going to be on politics and ideology. The ideological destitution of the remnants of post-Stalinist Marxism-Leninism based on the teleology of socialism, the promises and the failure to deliver in almost all respects. And by that sense, this all feeds into the idea of Western soft power being a prominent factor in the fall of the Soviet Union, from simple additions like Eastern satellites in the Warsaw Pact being dependent on West German credits, and of course the limitations of censorship and you can say the ideation of, or the idealization rather, of American consumer culture in terms of destroying the edifice and the spirit underpinning the fidelity to the Soviet constitution, the idea of socialism and Marxism-Leninism. So that is going to be a broad overview of what I'm covering. I'm also relying on two principal sources. There are other sources in the description, in particular an interesting article regarding the Brezhnev doctrine before Gorbachev. And other than that, I'm going to be reading from Stephen Kotkin's Armageddon Averted, which I would recommend for anyone who's interested in this topic to read, because it's very brief. It's only less than 200 pages if you read the revised edition. And the actual segment concerning the period up until 1991 is around 110 pages long. So it's a very concise, well-written introduction to this topic. And then there is the heavier tome, which is Hannes Odomite's Imperial Overstretch, which is considerably longer. Nevertheless, it is written with the benefit of access to more material, because it is a relatively recent tome. It was written in 2016. And there is a lot, particularly concerning ideology, which is brought out in this book, which I find very informative. There is also one point I want to bring up regarding the motivation for this stream. For some reason, or rather, I'm sure people in the audience may understand my motivation in doing this. I've been thinking a lot about the disintegration of superpowers at the moment, and the relationship between superpowers and their vassals. Maybe some people will wonder as to why I've been thinking so much about this particular concept. And obviously on this channel, I've been talking about the demise of the British Empire and what its ultimate legacy was. There are, of course, events going on in Ukraine and in the Middle East pertaining to a certain superpower, and the potential resurrection of the very nation I'm going to be bringing up today, all interesting implications regarding the fall of the Soviet Union. But indeed, what I find so fascinating about the fall of the Soviet Union is the speed, ease, and almost sort of inexplicable nature, how it could have been presided over the short term of a single man. And coming to this topic, it's sort of a seductive notion, and indeed it's something that's been touted more and more in Russia today, that Gorbachev was an agent of the West. And superficially, that seems like a very seductive explanation as to how the Soviet Union collapsed so successfully, and what happened in the 1990s, and indeed what is going on with the implications of the disintegration of the Soviet Empire. But I'm going to posit against that Gorbachev was far too successful to have been successfully sort of representing a Western agent. No Western agent, I believe, could have tactfully and so masterfully brought down the Soviet Union in the way that Gorbachev did. And moreover, Gorbachev isn't an aberration, as many people would think. He represents many precedents in Soviet history and indeed Russian history, and together as encapsulated in the figure of Mikhail Gorbachev. It is a reform program all coalescing at the same time with disastrous results, and that is what I find fascinating and remarkable about it. Obviously, I'm going to be referencing the overall history and purpose, ostensibly, of the Soviet Union. For people who want more content regarding the origins of the state, I have a discussion on Leninism and Bolshevism, a more broad discussion on the origins, intellectual origins of socialism, and a two-part series concerning the Soviet Empire under Stalin, Stalin's slave empire. Um, so other than Khrushchev, with this lecture, I hope to almost complete this mini saga on this channel regarding the Soviet Union. All right, on to the sources, and I'm reading here from Kotkin's Armageddon Averted. The Soviet Union was a land empire with a twist. Whereas the pre-revolutionary Russian Empire comprised only non-ethnic provinces, aside from the Duchy of Finland and the small Central Asian protectorates of Bukhara and Khiva. By the way, that more or less corresponds to the borders of modern Uzbekistan. The Soviet Union consisted of 15 nationally designated republics with state borders, the Soviet Socialist Republics. Beginning in the 1920s, Moscow presided over an expansion of the republic's national institutions and national consciousness, which endured the purges, mass deportations, and Russification. What he's referring to is something that I've brought up previously on this channel, which is the idea of kolonizatsiya, of laying down roots. And the premise behind this, in terms of thinking about the inevitable victory of the worldwide communist revolution, is that in order to build a genuinely universal state that the Soviet Union was supposed to be, Soviet literally means sort of workers' council. It was not a Russian empire conceived of originally, but rather a union of representative republics of the Soviet workers' councils. Indeed, the whole notion of satellite states came after, and the Russification is associated with Stalin's socialism in one country philosophy, or rather political program. So kolonizatsiya is the idea that one lays down roots to establish cultures within the broad spectrum of a workers' paradise, that is the Soviet Union, in order to bring around a multicultural cosmopolitan culture that would essentially be the vehicle towards universal integration of the nations into the Soviet project, regardless of what you think of that. Two of the Union republics, Ukraine and Belarusia, modern-day Belarus, got their own UN seats and all underwent economic development. Proudly, the Soviet Union contrasted itself with the capitalist empires of Britain or France. By the 1970s, however, after almost all overseas territories controlled by capitalist countries had gained independence, the idea of a better form of empire became an anachronism. The Soviet Union, moreover, did not just have an inner empire, but as also what George Orwell called an outer empire. And I'll bring up some maps here so you can see what I mean. This is the Soviet Union with the 15 respective republics. This is a more detailed map of the Soviet Union involving the administrative divisions within the Soviet republics. And this is a map of the Outer Empire, which includes the occupied nations of the Warsaw Pact in Eastern Europe. I'll just leave it onto this nation for now. So what Kotkin is really getting at regarding the effects of decolonization in the 1960s is that the Soviet Union came about in the 1920s and consolidated during the 1930s at a time where most of the European powers, and indeed Japan, were expansionist to some extent. I mean, that has to be qualified in some way, but they were vast expansionary empires encompassing many continents. In that way, the Soviet Union could contrast itself as allowing for some self-determination of their respective nations. And indeed, it was a universalist project who was supposed to transcend nationalism. So the Soviet Union ostensibly could posit itself versus the imperialism of the Western capitalists, as they would refer to them as, and say that the Soviet Union actually is pretty good regarding the efforts of the colonizers. But of course, the irony being that the Soviet Union is responsible for holding on to both an internal empire, the Soviet Union, which has come to resemble that much more of an empire versus some sort of socialist paradise as a result of Stalin, and of course the outer empire, the occupied countries in Eastern Europe. So obviously this, in terms of another theme running throughout this lecture, this presentation, is the idea of the fundamental contradictions within the Soviet system. And I'm using that term rather ironically, because of course the assessment of capitalism is the idea of ideological and economic contradictions which would ultimately lead to socialism and then the withering away of the state and the creation of communism. Nevertheless, ironically, it is the contradictions inherent in the Soviet Union that were more obvious during this time and also hasten the process of collapse, albeit abetted by certain actors. Chasing Hitler out of the Soviet Union back to Berlin presented Stalin with the irresistible opportunity of regaining some Tsarist territories, not reconquered in 1917-1921, and this is mainly referring to what is now Western Ukraine, Moldova, parts of Belarus, parts of Finland, and indeed the Baltic republics, and what later became Russia, Prussia, the Kaliningrad Oblast, and also in the process swallowing much of Eastern Europe, going back to Stalin. Not content merely to exercise political and military domination, the Soviet Union attempted from 1948 to clone satellite regimes. Yet Sovietization of Eastern Europe took place not during the 1930s Great Depression and fascist militarism, but during the post-war capitalist boom and deployment of comprehensive welfare states. In these altered circumstances, the fate of Soviet socialism was now irrevocably tied to the fate of regimes in Eastern Europe. Already in the early 1950s, and especially after Nikita Khrushchev had denounced Stalin in 1956, and Poland and Hungary had erupted in revolt, Eastern Europe weighed down the Soviet leadership. If we depart Hungary, Khrushchev told his colleagues behind closed doors, it will give a boost to the Americans, English and French, the imperialists. They will perceive it as weakness on our part and go on the offensive. Despite the crackdown, Hungary was eventually allowed to legalize some private entrepreneurship on enterprise, while Poland halted the collectivization of agriculture and conceded a prominent role for the Catholic Church, opening original fissures in the Soviet model of socialism. And indeed, this is a point that needs to be iterated regarding deviance within the overall economic and political mold of socialism, something that Kotkin and Adamite don't bring up is the peculiar path of Romanian, I will refer to as socialist nationalism to avoid obvious references to the other iteration of that. But you can almost say that there is an ideological sort of homogeneity in the East. There is a certain amount of deviation, and the Soviet Union has to essentially treat this ideological deviation within the process of managing a vast outer empire. It's as much as about limiting the costs of occupation and maintaining a system of control. But of course, in the context of decolonization, I mean, at the same time that we're seeing the crackdown in Hungary, we're seeing the end of the French occupation of Vietnam, we're seeing the war in Algeria, and we're seeing various other anti-colonialist uprisings throughout the empire. A couple of years earlier, there was the Malayan emergency. So the Soviet Union is acting like the other imperialist capitalist powers, and again, I'm using it in phrases of trying to make this seem ideologically consistent with their purported outlook. They are behaving more like a conquering imperialist power than promoting the ideas of a fraternal union of nations, which was the whole parroted idea behind the Sovietization of Eastern Europe, which is quite interesting. And indeed, there is the juxtaposition between socialists, communists, and all variety of leftists outside the Soviet Union. Already, of course, you have the conflict between Lenin and the Third International versus Stalin, and Stalin's desire to wrestle control of all the communist movements outside the Soviet Union under the direction of Moscow. So what 1956 does is turn many of the Moscow-aligned or Moscow-sympathetic socialists away from supporting the Soviet Union unconditionally. And this is simply a process that will intensify, as I will get into in a moment. In 1968, Moscow again felt compelled to invade an ostensible ally, to crush the efforts to reform socialism in Czechoslovakia, which became particularly embittered and damaged the USSR's international prestige, and what he's referring to is Dubček's Prague Spring. 2 years later, and again in 1976, mass strikes rocked Poland. In 1978, the first non-Italian since 1523, Karol Wojtyła, later John Paul II, of Krakow, Archbishop of Krakow, was chosen Pope. The next year, on the first pilgrimage home, more than 10 million Poles attended outdoor celebrations of the Mass, often weeping with joy. In 1980, Polish workers, inspired by the Pope and provoked by price increases, rose en masse, forming a countryside independent trade union and bringing the socialist system to the point of liquidation. A crackdown by Polish leaders in 1981 saved the regime for the time being. To pacify workers, the Polish regime had been borrowing from the West to import consumer goods, a dependency that became common across the Soviet bloc. And indeed, it's not just common across the Soviet bloc, but it's also something that affects Yugoslavia. And again, this idea of debt empires and economic dependency on rivals within some sort of great power competition is something that, for various reasons, has been weighing on me quite a lot. East Germany, which abutted a far richer West Germany, eventually accumulated a $26 billion foreign debt, and this is in 1980 money, whose servicing absorbed 60% of annual export earnings. But to buy off its walled-in people, Berlin Wall, the party leadership saw no alternative to increase other than to increase imports and thus Western dependence. The idea is essentially fogging off the population with bread and circuses. In Hungary, Poland, East Germany, and Czechoslovakia, the only force holding back the long-term tidal pool of the West appeared to be Soviet resolve. The acquisition of an outer empire in Eastern Europe, what again looked like a Soviet strength, had proved to be dangerously vulnerable. Of course, in the late 1940s, when Soviet-style socialism first appeared in Eastern Europe, it has seemed the leading edge of possibly a world takeover, especially after the 1949 victory of the Chinese communists in the world's most populous country. And I will always be reminded of that famous E.H. Carr lecture. E.H. Carr was a Soviet sympathetic historian with his Stalin picture saying the face of the future. Right. Few people understood that a major shift had indeed occurred, but in the opposite direction, to the grave detriment of Soviet socialism. Simply put, socialism was utterly dependent on the fortunes of capitalism, and the differences between capitalism in the Great Depression and capitalism in the post-war world were nothing short of earth-shattering. Indeed, another point to consider is that the Soviet Empire only survived World War II due to the dependence on Western aid and lend-lease, the essentially unfettered access to Western equipment, Western resources, Western goods, mainly from America, which the Soviet Union didn't need to pay back. No less momentous, the United States, which during the period of the Soviet Union's rise prior to the Second World War had remained somewhat aloof from European and Asian affairs, now assumed a vigorous role as leader of the free world, uniting previously fractious capitalist powers under its leadership to counter the Soviet threat. Imagine a geopolitical contest in which one side says, I will take West Germany and France, you get East Germany and Romania. I will take Britain and Italy, you will get Bulgaria and Hungary. I will take Japan and Saudi Arabia, you get Cuba and Angola. Just a point here, again, to reiterate, because I don't have a rosy picture of either side. I have a rather contemptuous picture of all political systems. Maybe that's just the sort of religious side of me coming through, the sort of anti-materialist side of me, but I have a very sort of uh, an opinion which lacks sentiment regarding the United States. And again, the leader of the free world is a euphemism. So nations like France under de Gaulle were very unhappy with the permutation of American influence into Europe, and de Gaulle left NATO, the equivalent of the Warsaw Pact for the West. Indeed, Japan obviously was an occupied country. Other nations were drawn into the American sphere due to economic aid, the Marshall Plan, and indeed, you can say, mutual advantage. In countries like Italy, say, for example, elections had essentially been fortified due to American interventionism. Nevertheless, I don't believe that Italian socialism was that powerful to be able to turn that country towards the Soviet Union, but just a point to consider. Even communist China became a threat to the Soviet Union after the Chinese split with Moscow and put themselves as an alternative model for the Third World, of course, Maoism versus Khrushchev. Mao, funnily enough, positioning himself as the doctrinaire Stalinist and Khrushchev as the revisionist. And what a burden the Third World entanglements could be. In the 1970s, Somalia-Ethiopia conflict, the Soviet Union decided to airlift heavy tanks to Ethiopia. But because long-distance supply planes could carry only a single tank, transport exceeded the cost of expensive tanks by 5 times. Never mind what a superpower was doing, seeking to influence countries whose main industry was civil war. Of course, the idea was in supporting leftist regimes in Africa to counteract American influence. And of course, they did this in Latin America as well, with Korea and Vietnam. Vietnam being the most successful, perhaps, iteration of this policy. And again, something to counteract the influence of Maoism, because the Vietnamese and the Chinese to this day hate each other. So there was ostensibly a reason for this, but as you can see, given the land nature of the Soviet Empire, it was prohibitively costly. And geopolitically, the United States had many more advantages, as has been outlined. But also, I want to bring people's attention back to a presentation I did earlier last year on Russia's greatest defeat. The idea that Russia as an empire, and obviously this would also refer to the geopolitical situation of the Soviet Union, needed to break out of a situation of being essentially landlocked. It needed to break out either into the North Sea, into the Mediterranean, into the Pacific Ocean, or both. And Russia was afforded that opportunity in one of these theaters and was horrifically defeated by the Japanese. So the Soviet Union has never got over this problem. And this is an issue which is going to warp the contest in the Cold War, which only really becomes so in the late 1940s and 50s. If there is a great power competition, looking at it simply through the views of military buildup and economic systems, then the Soviet Union was always at a disadvantage, irrespective of how successful socialism was purported to be, referencing back to this idea of Khrushchev declaring to the West, "We will bury you." Now, this is a good point to come back to economics and talking about oil in particular. And again, I'm reading from Kotkin. From 1910 to 1950, then when world oil output rose 12-fold, Russia production rose only 4-fold, though Baku was one of the main oil production centers of the world very early on, even during the time of the Russian Empire. One expert, writing in the early 1950s, warned that the oil supply is the Achilles heel of the Soviet economy. After the 1953 CIA-backed coup in Iran had helped block Soviet access to Iranian oil, the extensive Soviet manufacturing economy appeared to be in a pickle. But in 1959, some 30 years after a Soviet scientist had forecast the presence of vast oil deposits in the forested swamps of West Siberia, a gusher was struck. Between 1961 and 1969, 5 dozen new oil fields were identified, and the Kremlin went from being a net importer of oil to an exporter. Even more fortuitously, this desperately needed Siberian oil rush broke just as the 1973 Arab-Israeli War and accompanying oil shock caused an unexpected leap in world oil supplies and the greatest economic boon the Soviet Union had ever experienced. Without the discovery of Siberian oil, the Soviet Union might have collapsed decades earlier. From 1973 to 85, energy exports accounted for 80% of the USSR's expanding hard currency earnings, and that was not all. Other oil exporting countries, top customers for Soviet weapons, saw their oil revenues increase from 23 billion in 1972 to 140 billion in 1977. Many Arab oil states went on military spending sprees, increasing Moscow's oil windfall. What to do with all that cash? The Soviet leadership used its oil revenues to cushion the impact of the oil shock on its East European satellites. Oil money also paid for a huge Soviet military buildup that incredibly enabled the country to reach rough parity with the United States, and it helped defray the costs of the war in Afghanistan, launched in the late 1970s. And just a point here, I am focusing more intentionally on the disintegration of the Soviet Union from the Soviet side with reference to Western soft power, because I do not believe that hard US power and the military buildup under Ronald Reagan in particular really helped in terms of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, especially when we look at Gorbachev and later Bush Senior's policies. Really, it was just a sideshow. If anything, it was a propaganda victory for the United States more than anything else. And I stand by that, even though when the Soviet Union came to an end at the end of 1991, George Bush Sr. would retroactively claim this as to be a victory for the American empire, of course, not using those words, and the capitalist system, albeit that is very much retroactive. Right. It also helped defray the costs of the war in Afghanistan launched in the late 1970s. Oil money also went for higher salaries and better perks for the ever-expanding socialist elite. And oil financed the acquisition of Western technology for making cars, synthetic fibers, and other products for consumers, as well as Western feed and other products for consumers, as well as for Soviet livestock. In future, the inhabitants of the Soviet Union would look fondly on the Brezhnev era, recalling the cornucopia of sausages that had been available in state stores at subsidized prices. Oil seemed to save the Soviet Union in the 1970s, but it merely delayed the inevitable. The USSR had risen to become the world's largest producer of oil and natural gas, and the third largest of coal, but it nonetheless suffered chronic energy shortages. What the leading expert Attlee called a crisis amid plenty, that was because Soviet factories consumed energy in horribly gluttonous quantities as if it were free. Then in 1983, Siberian oil output began to decline. Output would recover in 1986, but after that it again declined, this time uninterrupted. Making matters worse, in 1986, world oil prices plummeted by 69% to one of their lowest levels in the post-war period. The dollar, the currency of the oil trade, also dropped like a stone overnight, An expert wrote, the windfall oil and dollar profits the Soviet Union had been enjoying for years wiped out. By this time, hungover from its long oil bender, the Soviet leadership was belatedly trying to address its profound structural economic troubles. Those troubles derived from the country's successes. Whereas in the 1920s, the Soviet economy had been about 20% industry, transport, and construction. By the mid-1980s, that percentage had risen to around 70. No other country ever enjoyed such a high percentage of its economy in big factories and mines, and much of the Soviet industry had been built during the 1930s or rebuilt after the destruction of the Second World War according to 1930 specifications. The USSR's Bethlehem, Pennsylvanians, and Sheffields numbered in the thousands, and they were even more antiquated. But flush with its oil windfall, the Soviet Union had avoided the painful devastation that befell the substantial yet smaller rust belts of the United States, Great Britain, and Germany. But it could not do so forever. In the 1990s, the overthrow of socialist planning would lay bare a far greater challenge of massive enterprise restructuring. Post-communist Russia would inherit and grandly privatize history's largest ever assemblage of obsolete equipment. Right in the midst of its great 1970s oil boom, the socialist revolution entered a decrepit old age. I do want to notify an observation. I made an observation here regarding the 1970s oil boom, which is that One of the oddities or features of the Soviet Empire was the contrast between the downturn in fortunes of the West and the resilience of the Soviet Empire. Many people point to the fact, Soviet sympathizers point to the fact that in the 1930s, the Soviet economy was relatively insulated from the effects of the Great Depression, which allowed it to build up its heavy industry manufacturing capacity to make it the world's largest exporter of things such as steel and military equipment. The same thing happens in the 1970s. And again, as we enter the crisis of the post-war consensus period in the 1970s and the turn towards monetarism or Reaganomics and Thatcherism in the West, the Soviet Union never had to go through such you can say, economic reform in the 70s and 80s, which eventually comes to it in the late 80s because of the oil windfall that helped sustain the Soviet system. Indeed, you can almost say that the economic boom in the 1970s, vis-a-vis the West and its relative economic decline, meant that détente in many ways was irrelevant. Nixon in China, Willy Brandt recognizing the borders of the Soviet Union and East Germany. All of these things were essentially made irrelevant in 1973 with the economic downturn of the West and the Soviet buildup and Andropov's desire to establish parity with the West. So just something to bear in mind. Soviet economic growth slowed substantially, and because quality was notoriously poor, requiring higher rates of replacement, a Soviet economy growing at 2% was tantamount to stagnation. So, for reference, the Soviet economy in the 1950s, early 1960s was growing about a rate of 6%. And by the 1980s, it was growing at a rate of 2%. So it was still technically growing. It just wasn't anything compared to, say, for example, the tiger economies in Korea, Singapore, um, even Japan, which had sort of reached its economic peak in the 1980s, early 1990s, and indeed the West. Soon, outright recession by official statistics set in. Decades of ecological degradation also reached the tipping point. Key demographic trends were reversed. Infant mortality began to rise, and life expectancy at birth began to decline. This negative data were covered up or falsified, but for the huge populations of the Soviet Union industrial toxic zones, there was no concealing the fact that respiratory ailments among children had become epidemic, that the incidence of cancer grew phenomenally, and that alcoholism, and absenteeism, already high, were rising. Behind this deep domestic funk lay the fact that competition with capitalism, not a policy, but something inherent to the system's identity and survival, was unwinnable. The 1973 oil shock initially had seemed to doom capitalism's remarkable post-war run, but it definitely pushed capitalism further onto a path of deep structural reforms. Those changes would soon cast the USSR's greatest ostensible achievement, its hyper-fossil fuel economy, upon which its superpower status rested, into a time warp, which its institutional framework could not and would not manage to confront. The 1980s decline in Soviet oil output and in world oil prices made the pain immediate, but it was by no means a foregone conclusion that the full intractability of these profound structural weaknesses would be exposed to the world and the inhabitants of the Soviet Union. What suddenly exposed and vastly accelerated the Soviet system's decline in the mid and late 1980s was an unavoidable generational change at the top, followed by a much anticipated campaign to reinvigorate the socialist system. That, of course, was Mikhail Gorbachev's ill-fated perestroika. Perestroika, that means restructuring. But the Brezhnev leadership ignored or downplayed the increasing imbalances with the United States, and after his death, the country could have continued on the same path. Relative to the West, the planned economy performed inadequately, but it employed nearly every person of working age, and the Soviet standard of living, though disappointing, was tolerable for most people. The Soviet Union was not in turmoil. Nationalist separatism existed, most prominently in the Caucasus and the Baltic states. But it did not remotely threaten the Soviet order. The KGB crushed the small dissident movement. The enormous intelligentsia griped incessantly, but it enjoyed massive state subsidies manipulated to promote overall loyalty. Respect for the army was extremely high. Soviet patriotism was strong. Soviet nuclear forces could have annihilated the world many times over. Only the unraveling of the socialist system in Poland constituted a danger, but even that was put off by the successful crackdown. Perestroika, however, was born not simply in tangible indicators, but in the crucial psychological dimension of the superpower competition. Among the Soviet elites, there was panic at the scope of Western advances, as well as the humiliation at the country's deepening relative backwardness. There were, in addition, unmistakable signs of internal defection in elite ranks. By the 1970s and early 1980s, large swaths of the Soviet Union's upper rank senior officials were traveling to the West, and whether patriots or cynics, they usually came back loaded down with boon boxes, VCRs, fancy clothes, and other goods. The highest officials had such items discreetly imported for them, while their children, the future generation of Soviet leadership, pursued coveted long-term postings abroad in the not very socialist occupation of foreign trade representatives. Many party posts, which served as vehicles for enrichment, were being sold to the highest bidder. In 1982, one emigre defector derided the USSR as a land of kleptocracy, meaning rule of thieves. Soulless indulgence, on top of a loss of confidence, had taken deep root, and this frightened loyalists most of all. This is a segment from H. Adamite's Imperial Overstretch, and this concerns the Brezhnev political system and the ascent of Andropov. The self-proclaimed stability of cadres had been one of the main building blocks of the Soviet system under Brezhnev. After the cycles of physical liquidation under Stalin and hectic physical liquidation, of course, this is a euphemism for the violent purges in the millions. And that's quite an interesting way of describing it. I've never seen it as a physical liquidation, but in a rather perverse way, that is a way of restructuring it, of structuring that whole phrase. It's interesting. Under Stalin and the hectic administrative reshuffling and frequent discoveries of anti-party groups in the Khrushchev era, what this means is that Khrushchev, of course, was flanking the Stalinists from the left, but he was always in a rather precarious position. Indeed, he had come to power of a anti-Lavrenti Beria coup. Lavrenti Beria was the most prominent and prestigious operative within the remnants of the NKVD and the ensuing structures that succeeded from the Soviet victory in the war. So he came to power as a result of the coup and then subsequently went on a purge, eliminating people like Malenkov, not eliminating, but politically marginalizing people like Marshal Zhukov, Malenkov, Molotov, and then, of course, he was ultimately deposed by Brezhnev. And the idea and system with the idea of anti-party groups is factionalism. Stalin used the idea of factionalism to purge enemies from his left and right. And if you want me to go over these various concepts, I have various videos on it. Look at the first Stalin video, or look at my even my ultra royalist video covers this idea of the left and the right within the whole Soviet dynamic. Indeed, it's something which I believe is most appropriate when discussing the Soviet Union. It's really meaningless when talking about politics outside of a leftist political system. So nevertheless, we're talking about, you can almost say, unpredictability and institutional insecurity. Why I believe Stalin was one of the greatest autocrats in history is that nearly everyone in the Soviet Union lived under the specter of a sword of Damocles that could fall at any moment. No one in the Soviet Union was not expendable, with rare exceptions like Marshal Zhukov, which Stalin wished he could essentially eliminate, but could not. He was so dependent on him. So Khrushchev attempted to prevent the incessant purges and the deaths However, one of the effects of the deaths meant that corruption in some instances was purged, but obviously malfeasance was still endemic to the Soviet Union throughout the Stalin period, throughout the Khrushchev era and the Brezhnev era. Brezhnev finally met the ruling elites longing for predictability and security of tenure at a price. Stability turned into stagnation in Russia, Zastoy. Corruption and nepotism became rampant. The new class of party officials became ever more insulated from society. The system of self-generating and self-selecting appointments according to centrally controlled lists, nomenclatura, turned party officials into an oligarchy or a special caste, something akin to an aristocracy with life peerage and provided power, perks, and privileges. In fairness, this you can say is a ideologically balked and more extreme iteration of rule of managers, of rule of bureaucracies, which of course is a factor of all managerial systems, whether West or East. The elite, if this term can be meaningfully applied, and I believe it can, just as an addendum, had its own clannish ties. This is the idea of a clientelism, special stores, maternity wards, funeral services, health resorts, and hunting lodges, private dachas. Its children spent time together, received priority access to higher education, and often intermarried. And again, this is idea of, you can say, Soviet credentialism, as well as privileged access into the managerial elite. Brezhnev's son, to take an example from the highest level of the hierarchy, became deputy minister for foreign trade, and his son-in-law was promoted to the first deputy of the interior. I believe this is consistent with, I mean, this is a prevalent theme throughout the entire Soviet Union. I am particularly interested in the career of one Zhanov, who was, I believe, the real sort of ideological successor to Stalin, had he not predeceased Stalin. And indeed, one of the facets which confirms him in my mind as a potential successor is not just the fact that he headed the Leningrad Communist Party, but he was also married to Stalin's daughter. There was one segment of growth in the period of stagnation, the bureaucracy. In accordance with Parkinson's law is the idea that the bureaucracy only exists to fill up time and increase work for itself rather than productivity. The number of bureaucrats in the Brezhnev era rose to unprecedentedly high levels. Again, the quote that the bureaucracy is expanding to meet the needs of the expanding bureaucracy. The party apparat expanded by tens of thousands of officials, many of whom incorporated as a result of the creation of agriculture departments and the party's district committees. About 500,000 officials, chinovniki, filled the hierarchical layers of the party bureaucracy and the central apparatus, the Politburo Secretariat, and the CC, the Central Committee departments, to the regional and local offices in the Union, republics, regions, districts, cities, and territories. Growth occurred also in the number of officials in state and economic administrations. Between 1975 and 1980, their ranks swelled by 3 million, and in 1984 surged to a level of 18.6 million bureaucrats. They could be found, some of the time at least, at their desks in the 36 councils of ministers, more than 1,000 ministries and state committees. 51,700 executive committees of the regional and local Soviets, 44,600 production and scientific production associations, 21,600 Zoskoi, state farms, collective farms, transportation, construction, trading, and service enterprises, as well as health and educational institutions. These data excluded the officers and men of the Soviet armed forces, the KGB, border troops, interior ministry, and the police. The strength of the 5 branches of the armed forces, the army, the navy, the air force, the strategic rocket forces. I've got another map here, which is from Kotkin, and air defense. Hopefully you can read some of that. And air defense added up to a total of about 5 million officers and men. 5 million officers and men in peacetime. This is what we mean by the oil boon enabling the Soviet Union to maintain this empire and attempt military parity with the West. The secret police, the KGB, had an estimated 720,000 agents on its payroll, And this agency and the Interior Ministry, the MBD, had under their command 570,000 officers and men in military formations, including several divisions of border and internal security troops. Excluded also were the officials in the labor unions, the youth organization Komsomol, which, by the way, is how Mikhail Gorbachev makes his sort of ascent within the party. He grows up in Stavropol in the south. He goes to Moscow, receives an education, goes into the Soviet prosecution service as a lawyer, and then decides that his political career will be served by joining the party, in particular Komsomol, and other social formations, collective farms, or the Kolkhozoi, and the state farms, Sovskoy. The numerical expansion of the administrative apparatus and the external and internal security services was matched by an increase in their political representation and influence. The defense minister and the head of the KGB became full members of the Politburo. Brezhnev appointed himself Marshal of the Soviet Union and emphasized his role as Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces. In addition to that, there is this I forget the word, but the a narcissistic obsession with awarding oneself various honors. So Brezhnev received the Hero of the Soviet Union moniker, which was the highest award, 4 times for himself. And indeed, there was a history written for him where his participation during the Second World War, the Great Patriotic War, was essentially made to be one of the crucial theaters of the conflict, which of course is completely preposterous, but such was Brezhnev's narcissism. You can say it almost goes beyond narcissism because Brezhnev was representative of the period of stagnation, but also this period of stability. You can say that the cult of Brezhnev, despite his failing physical and mental health, was essential in terms of building some sort of necrotic prestige around the Soviet elite as they age. Nevertheless, it should be pointed out that, as with the general sort of higher mortality rates among the Soviet population, the Soviet elite didn't actually live that long. Many dying of alcoholism and other related, liver failure and things like that, and then in their 50s and 60s. Brezhnev wasn't actually that old. Important questions of internal and external security were discussed and decided in a reactivated Defense Council, a select body of top party and state officials and high-ranking military officers. Prominence, status, and prestige of the military were demonstrably elevated. On the occasion of official celebrations in Red Square, the top military leaders were prominently placed atop the rostrum at the Lenin Mausoleum at the right-hand side of the General Secretary being the head of the party, a office which is fundamental to the overall paramount leadership of the Soviet Union since Stalin. As if to demonstrate equality with the party, they took up half of the rostrum. The armed forces were called upon to assume a new internationalist function in order to be able to advance worldwide state interests. For that purpose, the Navy and the Air Force were equipped with long-range intervention capabilities, and you can still say that this is consistent with the idea that whilst the Soviet Union is socialism in one country, the Brezhnev Doctrine is responsible for maintaining ideological purity within the vassals, but also, of course, extending socialism in the Third World in the contest against American-led interventions and attempts to co-opt developing nations into the capitalist order. The priority allocated to military industry and the economy, the privileged position of the military in politics and society, as well as the more prominent role of the armed forces in foreign policy, could be interpreted as rampant Bonapartism, or at least a successful bid for military power at the expense of the party. This, however, would be an erroneous interpretation of the essence of civil-military relations under Brezhnev. The undoubted growth in the military status and influence did not result from politicization of the armed forces or the deliberate push for power, but from a pull exerted by the party. Again, this is something that Stalin was able to achieve. Stalin's power base was from the party, and using the position of the General Secretary, he was able to subordinate all party functions, by extension, the real sort of administrative capacity and system of fealty, loyalty, which emanated throughout the ministries to the person of the General Secretary and obedience to the party. The Soviet elite from the 1920s feared the rise of Bonaparte, all of them, of course, being focusing on the Thermidorian reaction during the French Revolution and the coup of Brumaire, which brought Napoleon into power. The idea of a military dictator being able to co-opt and subvert the revolution. They thought this was Lenin. It turned out that Lenin's Bonapartism was subverted by uh, Stalin's Robespierreanism, Maximilien Robespierre from the French Revolution, of course. And all we do is see the idea of a military ruler, a general leading the revolution, to the idea of an all-powerful party controller, whether it be um, someone actively pursuing that role like Stalin, or someone rather passively assuming the headship of that mantle like Brezhnev. And of course, this was something that was precarious. Khrushchev believed he could have been deposed by Marshal Zhukov, and so actively purged him from the ranks of these sort of upper echelons of the Soviet power. So it wasn't necessarily that stable. Nevertheless, it succeeded. There wasn't a military coup. The same can be said for the enhanced role of the secret police in the 1970s and early 1980s. The KGB was permitted to increase its influence and representation in the Central Committee and the party bureaus of the Union republics. Haydar Aliyev, head of the KGB in Azerbaijan, and Boris Pugo, his counterpart in Latvia, became party chiefs in their respective republics. Andropov was chief of the KGB until his transfer to the party apparatus in May of 1982. Under his tutelage, the secret police became ever more prominent and active. It was instrumental in implementing a whole series of restrictive measures, curbing cultural expression, religious rights and freedoms, and the free flow of information. It helped stifle and silence dissent. It persecuted and suppressed human rights groups like the Helsinki CSCE watch committees. The idea that in 1975 the Soviet Union signed up to the maintenance of uh, human rights. All along, the KGB engaged in image building. It fostered the idea that it was a modern, efficient, and reliable institution, devoid of internal corruption, and dedicated to furthering the interests of the party, the state, and the people, and hence entitled to a privileged role in politics and society. Bureaucratization and militarization interacted with the crisis of political leadership. One of its many causes lay in the serious health problems that Brezhnev developed after 1975. In the last years of his rule, he was said to have been able to work only for a few hours each day. His death in November 1982 at the age of almost 76 thus came almost as a relief to the reform-minded officials in the party and government. In fact, the Politburo's selection of Andropov as his successor was greeted, according to Chernev, with an outburst of ovations. In the November 1982 plenary meeting of the Central Committee, such outbursts had occurred previously, some of them carefully stage managed. This time, however, the enthusiasm appeared to be genuine. The new leader had the reputation of being intelligent, shrewd, skillful, hardworking, and immune to corruption. He was regarded as having a remarkable mind, political talents, and an intellectual bent, and being incorruptible and selfless, which on occasion bordered on asceticism, being like a monk. His record as ambassador to Hungary during the 1956 revolution, CC secretary in charge of relations with the ruling communist parties in the 1960s, and the head of the KGB in the period of 1967 to 1982, made him appear better informed than anyone in the top leadership about the shortcomings of the Soviet system and the problems of the empire in Eastern Europe. What those positions essentially entail is that he was intimately aware with the systems of administration and foreign policy within the Eastern Bloc. He was well versed in party politics, and of course, he was in charge of the internal security apparatus. He seemed to combine perfectly the qualities of enlightened intellectual and efficient technocrat. Nothing, however, was to come of the high hopes that accompanied his appointment. He merely prescribed the time-honored Soviet medicine of a new campaign to cure the social economic ills that had befallen the country. The campaign was conducted under the head of mobilizing of reserves inherent in the system in order to modernize it. The imposition of discipline was meant to help this effort. The structural deficiencies of the system had led to a plethora of activities at the margin or outside the legal framework, and a thriving second economy. Many of these, a second economy meaning a black market. Many of these activities were advantageous to the consumer since they mitigated the rigidities of central planning and alleviated supply and distribution shortages. Um, what are you talking about in the chat? Uh, as I try and encourage when it comes to the chat in these conversations, please try and keep all comments relative to the topic being discussed. Thank you. I hate to be boring, but I do periodically check over comments to see if there's anything I can respond to. And at the moment, I'm reading about emus, so please do better, chat. Yet rather than legalizing and constructively channeling these forms of private initiative, it also makes me feel that I'm being tedious and boring. I hate to sound like a teacher, but these things are quite distracting. Yet rather than legalizing and constructively channeling these forms of private initiative, the new party leader set out to eradicate them. He decreed a relentless struggle against social parasites, idlers, work shirkers, and violators of workers' discipline. New regulations went into effect imposing harsher penalties for certain economic offences, such as bribery, speculation, and theft of products or tools from the workplace. The police were roused from their doldrums and forced to conduct dragnet operations in shops, bars, restaurants, movie theatres, and steam baths to check whether the people found there had legitimate reasons or were skipping work. The dragnet operation was also employed as part of yet another anti alcoholism campaign. Drunkards were rounded up and punished, pay cuts, demotions, and public denunciations. It is possible that Andropov considered the expansion of police powers and intrusion into the private sphere to be a preparatory stage for a far more reaching structural changes, perhaps even in a more liberal direction. If so, such changes were never outlined. A mere 3 months after his inauguration as General Secretary of the party, he was put on a dialysis machine for kidney failure. In April 1983, rumors abounded that he no longer commanded a majority among the top leadership. Politburo and Central Committee meetings were postponed. The party chief was last seen in public on the 18th of August 1983. Like actors in a farce and in repetition of practices adopted in the last years of Brezhnev's life, Andropov's subordinates excused the party's leader's absence with claims that he was suffering from recurrent colds. Letters and documents were published on his behalf to prove that he was keeping abreast of the affairs of state and working indefatigably. Yet Andropov was not at hand to announce and justify the countermeasures in response to the West German parliament's decision to deploy immediate-range nuclear missiles. And he failed to appear in public in order to explain the circumstances that led to the destruction of a civilian Korean airliner. These tasks were left to Marshal Ogorov, the Soviet Armed Forces Chief of Staff. Essentially, Soviet decision-making, or lack thereof, had reverted to the last years of the Brezhnev stagnation. The political and personal agony, perhaps merciful, came to an end on 9th of February 1984 when Andropov died. Now, why am I bringing up Andropov so much and referring to Andropov? Here I have a series of images of prominent Communist Party officials who play major roles in the story going forward. For the acronyms that I'm using, GCCPSU, General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union; SS, in the case of Suslov, Second Secretary to the to the General Secretary, but in his position it also means Senior Secretary for Ideology. And we also have the Vice President of the Soviet Union, we have the Foreign Minister, and we have the Minister of Defense. But as we see with Brezhnev represents a period of stagnation. Andropov is one of these interesting figures that, had he lived longer and had he represented that virility and health that was supposed to accompany his experience and his ultimately thwarted reform program, he could have represented a way of allowing for the Soviet system on harsher terms to endure, focusing on anti-corruption and perhaps in terms of purging the ranks of the corrupt Soviet elite by his focus on anti-alcoholism, his own aestheticism, and the expansion of the powers of the KGB and the MVD in terms of regulating other people's lives, you can say that in many ways this could have represented an interesting sort of brand of perestroika under the guise of some sort of reawakening of a Beria-esque terrifying security chief, or even a Stalin, and this could have coincided with some military purges. Indeed, when Adamite talks about the liberal direction, this was actually something that Beria, another security chief, had brought up in his own reform program in the 1950s. Andropov, to me, represents the last chance, effectively, the Soviet had of continuing in the similar Marxist-Leninist mold that had brought it up until this point. Indeed, when we're talking about the idea of intervention, you can say discipline campaigns, rallying people behind, tougher discipline, exhorting them to meet production targets, to do more in terms of the realization of the Soviet utopia. Of course, this harkens back to the purest form of the sort of anti-materialist materialism, as ridiculous as that sounds, heroic socialism in the 1930s and during the war, and of course in the immediate after-war period during Stalin. Coinciding with complete control of the Soviet system, a closed system underpinned by a vast security apparatus that would even weaponize the use of psychiatric institutions and mental health in order to declare that people who stood outside of the Marxist-Leninist paradigm and would critique it were themselves clinically insane. That's one way, of course, in terms of being able to implement a certain rigid discipline among Soviet and an appeal to Soviet orthodoxy, effectively treating them as mentally deranged or as heretics. And I will bring this up because this is in stark contrast to the ideas of liberalization associated in particular with glasnost, the opening up of the country. But nevertheless, it represents an alternative route towards a harsher imperial system that we see with Andropov, had he been able to combine his ambitions with his virility. Instead, what happens as a result of Andropov's death is it's a degradation of the sclerotic and petrified system of stagnation that we see under Brezhnev. Brezhnev represented stability, but he also represented the corruption and the rotation of a vast, ever-increasing managerial elite. When Suslov died, pictured here, he's the figure next to Brezhnev on the right, it precipitated a crisis within the Soviet elite because of Andropov's illness. He had been touted as a possible successor to Brezhnev, and his death allowed Andropov to come to power in the first place. But all of a sudden now Andropov was at death's door after his liver failure. So the septuagenarian Goronocrats, rule of the elderly, went through the system of appointing Chernenko, who was the chief of the Central Committee Secretariat of the Communist Party. Chernenko was essentially useless. Like Brezhnev, he was effectively dying. He only ruled in name as General Secretary for a year before he himself died. And he was controlled by figures such as Gromko, that you see on the right, who was in charge of Soviet foreign policy for a quarter of a decade, and by military figures such as Ustinov, but even Ustinov died during the period of Chernenko. So when it came to the remnant of the Soviet elite under Brezhnev, who had held power around him as a court, the way that the Soviet Union could have maintained a collective form of rulership within a single generation is to allow for a circulation of these decrepit elites. And indeed, that was possibly the route the Soviet Union was going to go with the unexpected premature demise of Andropov and the ascent of Chernenko, that the system could have continued in this petrified, stagnant state indefinitely. And a figure such as Gorbachev, who rose through the ranks prematurely, he became part of the the Ministry of Agriculture after moving from the Youth League. And the premature death of his 60-year-old predecessor meant that he had risen up the ranks of the Communist Party very quickly, And when Chernenko died, he was only 54. But due to all the deaths, there were many positions in the top echelons of the Soviet Party which could enable someone like a Gorbachev to come to power. And this is why I bring up Andropov again. Andropov favored Gorbachev. He wanted Gorbachev to succeed him. He didn't want Chernenko and the petrified elite to continue in the way that had characterized the last few years of Brezhnev's term as general secretary. And the reason he focused on a succession plan regarding Gorbachev was because Gorbachev was consistent with the campaigns for discipline, the consistent trend of asceticism regarding purging the Soviet elites of all the vices and corruption that had become endemic within the system, or stable, albeit kleptocratic. So Andropov could see that Gorbachev was a true believer. He was part of the Khrushchev generation. He was an anti-Stalinist, yet at the same time, he was very consistent in terms of a sort of pro-Stalinist historiography regarding the Second World War. Khrushchev, in many ways, was a contradictory character, ideologically inconsistent, but Andropov believed that he was a purist, and he represented a fundamentally needed generational change within the party. Andropov, of course, focused on military parity and on party discipline, and you can say Marxist-Leninist orthodoxy, and he couldn't have anticipated the effectiveness of Gorbachev's purge of all of these figures that you see on the top right, or at the top, or essentially the figures that represented the older generation. Gorbachev was very successful in eliminating all the vestiges of their legacy, something that Andropov could not have expected. But before I come to the ideological element of this and Gorbachev and perestroika, I want to bring this back to, you can say, the crisis of confidence within the Soviet system, which would explain, add context to the rise of someone like Gorbachev and the hopes, or rather the misplaced hopes, that would come from his ascent. But first of all, I want to bring this back to the period of Stalin. Victorious from the Second World War, the Soviet dictatorship felt no imperative to change and fell back upon familiar patterns of bureaucratic hypercentralization and economics by command. Propagandists exhorted the weary populace to rebuild the country, which they did brick by brick, despite the haranguers. The state media revived the pre-war theme of hostile capitalist encirclement and relentlessly demonized the West, casting Soviet deprivation once again as a matter of heroic sacrifice. Heavy industry, as in the 1930s, received the bulk of investment, and the country regained, and by the 1950s surpassed, its pre-war Fordist, of course referring to mass industrial production and assembly lines, industrial base. It also exploded its own atomic bomb. So there was a period after the war, and as part of reconstruction, of the heroic rebuilding of the socialist project within the Soviet Union and expanded out to the fraternal states within the Warsaw Pact. Of course, these are all ideological euphemisms, but nevertheless they held some sway, not simply in a cynical way, for true believers of the Soviet system, such as Khrushchev. This, however, underpins something which is rather remarkable about the contradictions inherent within the Marxist-Leninist project, and something that many were able to observe very quickly, people such as Gramsci, even socialist sympathizers, leftists such as the philosopher Bertrand Russell, that the Soviet model had effectively failed. It wouldn't represent socialist utopianism. And this is because the entire project was founded on a materialist venture. The whole notion of it was that it was supposed to create an economic paradise. And yet, the strength of the Soviet system during World War II and before was in its ability to mobilize and indeed enslave its population towards the service of higher goals. So the apex of the Soviet Union is the patriotism which is inculcated in the struggle in the Great Patriotic War, but that is focused on deprivations and sacrifice. It is the construction of a system which essentially will be inherited by future generations, but it never is. So languishing within a period of stagnation and with cultural permutation coming in from the West, and looking at this simply from a point of view of materialism, I believe that the Soviet Union could have only survived through embracing this idea of heroic anti-materialist materialism. And that's why, in many ways, it was doomed from the start, because it could not continue with that, because controlled economy was never going to catch up with the West. The Soviet Union's strengths lay, you can say, in this constant struggle for mastery of the world and military struggle. Yet the minute you adopt an insular policy promoted on peace, and it simply becomes a competition of cultural and economic forces, the Soviet system will always come out lacking. Indeed, the Soviet Union has an eschaton. It is materialistically and historically deterministic. It believes that all of these things are inevitable. So when the Soviet system fails to deliver on these promises, and the whole thing is contrasted relativistically with the West, then the ideological underpinnings, justification for the system begins to collapse. And had, say, for example, the system not been inherently materialistic, had it, say, for example, been in the system in service of religion or any other sort of pervading ideology, the Soviet Union could have actually represented a limitation of all these contradictions. But of course, it is fundamentally the materialism of the Soviet Union, I think, which underpins it, which also dooms it. But that's just on a thematic level, which I'll get into in more depth. By the late 1970s, townspeople, I'm reading from Kotkin, outnumbered country folk by almost 2 to 1. And whereas towards the end of Stalin's time, most urbanites still lived in barracks or communal apartments, sharing kitchen and bar with other tenants, under Brezhnev, more than half the growing city population lived in apartments with private baths and kitchens. Millions of families were also able to build modest country retreats, dachas, with vegetable gardens. Between 1970 and 78, the number of domestic vacationers at sanatoria resorts jumped from 16 million to 35 million, while another 1 million per year traveled to Eastern Europe. By this time, more than 90% of Soviet families owned refrigerators and more than 60% owned washing machines. There were significantly more goods than before, yet much of the Soviet population queued for hours to obtain basic necessities and had to turn to the more expensive shadow economy of informal production in exchange for children's clothes, proper-sized adult shoes, and other scarce items. That was because manufacture of consumer goods lagged behind production of military and heavy industry, and central planning empowered producers, not consumers. Similarly, no matter how joyous people were when moving into a new prefabricated apartment, usually after waiting 10 years, their space was invariably insufficient, 1, 2, at most 3 rooms for husband, wife, children, and grandparents. The authorities just could not keep up. And although people had more, they were demanding more on the basis of wider horizons, going back to the fundamental focus on materialism being the raison d'etre of the Soviet Union. Back in 1950, the year Gorbachev had entered Moscow University, there were 1.25 million students enrolled in higher education and about 3% of the population. But by the late 1970s, fully 10% of the Soviet population had completed college, about 70% had completed high school, compared to 40% in 1950. Mass media technologies, motion pictures, radio had long been important to the Soviet dictatorship's um, ability to disseminate the kinds of information and ways of interpreting the world it deemed appropriate. These remained powerful state levers, but over time, foreign content increasingly entered the stream of mass culture in the Soviet Union. Notwithstanding censorship into the 1950s, Soviet radios meant a wire hooked up to a feed bringing 1 or 2 stations from Moscow, rather than wave receivers. But by the late 1960s, wave radios came to exceed wire ones, and the total number of all radios grew to nearly 90 million. Technically adept reconfiguring Soviet manufactured radios to receive shortwave from abroad broadcasts as part of the Cold War. True, a good part of state radio facilities were busy producing static to cover up Radio Liberty, the BBC, Deutsche Welle, and Voice of America, which collectively were known as the Voices. Yet listeners could escape jamming out in the country and learn the forbidden details of Soviet political life and world events. In this creeping post-war cultural invasion of the USSR by the West, an even more important role was played by the images and details of consumerism, some of which were being delivered by a new quintessential mass medium, television. The number of Soviet TV sets leaped from 400 in 1940 to 2.5 million in 1958, 30 million 10 years later, and 90 million in the 1980s, by which time they could be found in 93% of households. Post-war programs began to focus on home life, and the beginning in the mid-1970s, the authorities permitted translations of family serials from Britain and France and other capitalist countries. Such shows, like the increasingly available foreign films, were watched as much for clues of material life as for entertainment. Soviet audiences would intently observe the characters moving through well-furnished homes from one room to another and then another room, sometimes 8 or more in all. The characters also appeared in different clothes each day, peered into overstuffed refrigerators, and drove sleek cars. Was it all fantasy? Certainly, Soviet television was dominated by official views, and in general, control over communications remained very tight. Private telephones were kept to a minimum, 25 million, fewer than one for every 10 people, and typewriters had to be registered with the police. Access to photocopiers was tightly restricted, but tape recorders, owned by about one-third of the population, as well as cheap X-ray plates, facilitated the circulation of forbidden Soviet popular ballads, as well as smuggled rock and roll. In 1968, ostensibly to combat worrisome trends in youth culture, Komsomol officials gathered at a retreat to watch the officially banned film Easy Rider. Soon, almost every Soviet high school and factory acquired its own rock and roll band, which the Komsomol hired to perform at official events. By the late Brezhnev era, Soviet public spaces were decorated not just with official slogans, but also with graffiti about sport, teams, rock music, sex, and the merits of punk music versus heavy metal. School children ranked each other by their genes, with Western brands being the highest. This infatuation with the Western consumer culture was a far cry from the heroic October Revolution and Civil War, the 1930s building of socialism, or the Second World War, which had helped shape the early generation. Despite prominent post-war campaigns to settle virgin lands and build a second railroad through Siberia, it was clear that the mobilizational style of political participation and socialization was losing much of its force. Equally important, the party's grand historical teleology had to be abandoned. As the predicted date of 1980 for the transition to communism passed, ideologues replaced Khrushchev's utopian promise with the here and now of developed socialism. Was life simply a question of washing machines, refrigerators, private cars, TVs, popular music, and jeans? And if so, what did that portend for socialism's struggle against capitalism? And this again is referring back to the idea of materialism being fundamental to the Soviet Union, yet it being unable to thrive in terms of a materialistic contrast for the West. Indeed, I find it remarkable in a way that the ideological and moral contest during the Cold War is essentially that of two systems of materialism, and it is predicated on those systems. It doesn't really of course, the West will all talk about superior morality, and of course, the situation will exist in the East. But you can say, if anything, it represents some sort of intellectual poverty regarding the West and the East, that it's simply become a contrast of these economic systems and the advance of materialist culture, consumer identity, and the fact that the Soviet Union is the inheritor of the Stalinist Fordist mold of heavy industry and mass production from the 1930s, which is geared towards success and expansion in war, which of course was essential for the Soviet Union to survive in the 1920s, the 1930s, and indeed, of course, during the Second World War. That shouldn't be omitted. So again, we're talking about fundamentals in terms of the ideological underpinning of the system. Nevertheless, like I said, it could have survived in this petrified state reliant on a vast security apparatus, or indeed some sort of ideological shift beyond that of materialism. A strong allegiance to socialism, understood as state responsibility for the general welfare and social justice, remained very much part of ordinary people's worldview. confirmed by such facts as the near impossibility of being evicted from their state providers' apartments, whatever the circumstances. Indeed, when looking at the capitalist system versus the socialist system, the idea, of course, is creating an entire nation of dependence. So the fact that the Soviet Union ostensibly could provide a living for everyone, it couldn't offer very much in terms of material advancement for people outside the managerial elite, of course. Nevertheless, for the poorest, the system could ostensibly provide an alternative towards the rat race, as it were, when it came to capitalist economies. And the whole idea of this, of course, was underpinning social justice. But this also meant that there was virtually nothing in the way of opportunities for enterprise, private enterprise, the expansion of private property, which really didn't exist in the Soviet Union, or a burgeoning middle class. Substantial legitimacy for socialism was also derived from the commemoration of the Second World War in films, memoirs, veterans groups, and monuments, all of which, like military patriotic education, were expanded into the 1960s. The main Soviet holiday, Revolution Day, became a showcase for Soviet military hardware, though for many it was noteworthy for the extra consumer goods and alcohol made available. But Victory Day was a powerful collective ritual involving family trips to the cemetery, whose meaning was shared by almost the entire country. Victory Day also underscored the attainment of superpower status and reinforced respect for the armed forces. Of course, coercion remained an integral aspect of maintaining allegiance. And of course, sympathy and the centrality of victory in the Second World War, it fulfilled an imperialistic object. First of all, it's the defense of the homeland and driving out the invader, which actually became part of the Soviet national anthem, which was commissioned by Stalin during the Second World War. The triumphalism associated with that and the victory by Lenin's political system and the faithful follower Stalin. But of course, that isn't a materialistic object. That's about defending one's homeland, defending an ideological system, expanding it, and being able to consolidate it. It's not, again, it's something that transcends base consumerism. And that is why I believe it's so powerful, because it harkens back to Russia. It's a great patriotic war. It is in a system of national defense. Of course, Stalin deliberately drew parallels with Napoleon's invasion in 1812 and to a lesser extent Russia's experience in the First World War, which of course was relatively disastrous. So the comparison to 1812 was seen as more apt. Indeed, Stalin was obsessed in terms of going to create historical parallels. So that represented something that transcended the whole notion simply of worldwide peaceful transition to communism. It represented victory in war. And indeed, in terms of this idea being able to transcend anything to do with Soviet communism, it is still part of the ideological bedrock of Putinism and Russia today, the commemoration of the last of Russia's veterans from the Great Patriotic War. So there is nothing about it which has become indispensable in terms of socialism being categorized as part of that whole thing. You can eschew socialism, view it as a patriotic struggle to defend one's homeland, and indeed, socialism is redundant to that whole system, which is why it's remarkable in many ways that, and indeed necessary, for the Soviet Union to have relied on the mythology of something which was redundant to the whole philosophy of Marxism-Leninism. Right. This, I believe, is a good time to briefly reference the state of the economy before finally getting to Gorbachev. It is going to be quite a long lecture, as you can see, but that's only for my desire to be as comprehensive as possible when reviewing this topic. Has anyone mentioned anything in the chat that's interesting? So long as you're not talking about emos, I'll be very happy. Fantastic. Gorbachev knew, actually no, sorry, wrong segment. Got it all mislabeled. Here we are. Frustration with the planned economy had been a topic for internal wrangling for decades. A confidential report in June of 1965 by the Soviet economist Abel Agambegian, sorry for that pronunciation, later a top Gorbachev advisor, pointed out that the Soviet growth rate was slowing, just as the US rate seems stronger, and that key sectors for the Soviet standard of living, housing, agriculture, services, and retail trade, were especially backward. By way of explanation, The Economist singled out the exorbitant resources devoted to the military and the extreme centralism of economic management. He further noted that the Central Statistical Administration did not have a single computer or any prospect of acquiring one. The report was not published. Self-defeating hyper-secrecy had been another of the Economist's culprits, but in September 1965, then Prime Minister Alexei Kosygin did launch a major economic reform. It was aimed at improving planning by allowing greater flexibility for enterprises and at redressing the imbalance between military and consumers. Predictably, ministries and parallel Communist Party departments resisted ceding central authority to enterprises, while the military balked at sacrifices to increase consumer goods. Even without such resistance, a little flexibility proved useless, since managers wanting to cut costs were not allowed to dismiss workers. Nor could costs be factored into prices, since repercussions from raising prices frightened the leadership even more than unemployment. The Kosygin reforms failed even before the events in Prague in 1968 undercut the will for experimentation. In Czechoslovakia, this is a period known as normalization, a return to orthodoxy, or bringing back a sort of appropriate era of Eisenhower, keine Experimente, no experiments, relying instead on stability at all costs, regardless of the longevity of the economic system, which is kept on by interventions such as that of the oil boom in the 1970s. Instead, the Kremlin decided in the 1970s to pursue the computerization of production and planning and to import Western technology. To overcome a Cold War ban on technology transfers, the KGB set successful industrial espionage, but few of their acquisitions paid off. Soviet factories proved unwilling or unable to introduce the new technologies, particularly information systems. By the 1980s, the entire Soviet Union had just 200,000 microcomputers, leaving aside their quality, while the United States had 25 million. And that number was about to skyrocket. The very engine that had powered a peasant society to superpower status, the industrial plant economy, seemed increasingly to be exerting a severe drag. Consider the Soviet steel industry, which produced 160 million tons annually, far more than any other country. By the 1980s, Soviet manufacturers used more than 1 million sizes and shapes of rolled steel. Since it was impossible to predict the proportions of each size or shape to be needed by each firm, because we're not living in a market economy of supply and demand, the planners provided a range to producers. But since every plant performance was measured by the weight of its output, a producer got more credit for heavier strips. There was, however, a greater need for the thinner varieties. With no choice, companies took the thicker strip. Perhaps they could barter it on the vast internal black market among companies. If not, they would machine it down to the desired thickness. Perversely, the sheared off metal counted in the Soviet GDP, even though it was discarded and made the production of finished goods more costly. Furthermore, although manufacturing was forced to shave off a significant portion of metal they received, Soviet machines, cars, and refrigerators were far heavier than Western counterparts. Durable goods factories were also rewarded not for profits, but for output tonnage. In short, the logic of the planned economy was devastatingly simple: quantity ruled. And by the late 1970s and early 1980s, after decades of extensive growth, even quantity was becoming a problem. Gorbachev's economic reform sought to address both the underlying logic and the recent negative trends. His program introduced what, by Soviet standards, was unprecedented autonomy and profit loss calculation for large enterprises across the whole economy, as well as joint ventures, a revival of Lenin's new economic policy to attract foreign capital. Gorbachev also sought to improve the outlook for consumers by legalizing service companies under the guise of cooperatives. The bold strategy by Soviet standards combined and reworked the major economic reforms of Eastern Europe, the Yugoslav self-management system in industry, and Hungary's private service sector. But immediately, Soviet cooperatives suffered from a reputation for shadiness and for criminal groups extorting protection payments. In industry, Gorbachev, like Kosygin before him, found himself relying on recalcitrant ministerial bureaucracy to implement an improbable decentralization that would entail a significant loss of ministerial authority. So again, the managerial elite becoming an authority independent of nominally the higher ups in terms of permitting this idea of perestroika, restructuring, uh, fundamental managerial resilience to change, resistance to change. Also, like Kosygin, Gorbachev stopped short of permitting real market prices for inputs and output, undermining the effects of whatever autonomy enterprises did manage to exercise. Going halfway towards the benefits of market criteria turned out to be no way. Such recurring contradictions in this Sisyphean attempts to have a planned economy reform itself. Sisyphus in Greek mythology, the man in Hades who is attempting to roll the boulder up to attain his freedom, but always has the boulder inevitably rolled down, and the process begins again and again. Without undoing planning or socialism, were compounded by miscalculations. In a blitz to re-equip obsolete manufacturing plants while also trying to force them to increase output, huge investments were sunk into machine building and engineering industries. The funds were wasted. At the same time, after world oil prices had sharply dropped in 1986 and devastated hard currency earnings, Soviet imports of consumer goods were curtailed without new investments in domestic light industry, thereby putting tremendous pressure on the standard of living, even as perestroika had raised expectations among the public. So what we're seeing is that economic reforms and political reforms are coinciding with a externally sort of precipitated economic downturn. Of course, all this does is undermine the legitimacy of reform. Also, the economy's most advanced sectors, defense, whose exports might have paid for purchasing consumer goods, were targeted for drastic downsizing. Worst of all, imperial retrenchment, Gorbachev's ace in the hole cost money to pay for decommissioned Soviet troops and arming former clients to defend themselves. Like the self-inflicted financial debacle that resulted from the anti-alcohol campaigns, these blunders, the work of the country's top economists, were devastating. That a concerted, expert-advised reform had made matters worse came as a shock. Prior to 1985, the planned economy, greased with extensive black marketeering, choked by phenomenal waste, and increasingly dependent on foreign imports, had stagnated, but it had functioned. Compared with their parents and grandparents, the Soviet population was better fed, better clothed, and better educated. Comparisons, however, were made not with the Soviet past or developing countries, but with the richest nations in the world, and both the leadership and population expressed increasing impatience. To compete with advanced capitalism, the only recourse seemed to be going beyond partial reforms and introducing the very mechanisms, private property and the market, whose suppression constituted the essence of socialism. In short, undoing the revolution and the regime's identity. And that's a good segue to come back to Adamite and talking about the general discrediting, the intellectual bankruptcy of socialism beyond the material. In any political or imperial system, ideology can be said to play a number of important functions. It can fulfill four major functions: analytical, cognitive, utopian, visionary, missionary, operational, legitimizing. By the end of the 1970s, Marxist-Leninist ideology failed to fulfill any of these functions. Alexander Yakovlev, the chief architect of a major revision and ultimately destruction of the whole edifice of Soviet ideology, made this very clear. The theoretical basis of which the Soviet system and the Soviet Union's approach to international politics rested, as he told a conference of Communist Party secretaries in September of 1989, had been gravely deformed. The model of socialist development, as exemplified by the Soviet Union, had essentially exhausted itself. Indeed, each and every major cognitive and predictive element of Marxist-Leninist ideology had turned out to be false. Some of the dogmas had been revised under Khrushchev, notably the idea that military conflict among the imperialist states was as inevitable as war between imperialism and socialism. But other major formalized perceptions and predictions have remained in force. This concerned the notions that the contradictions between the power centers of imperialism were more basic than the links that unite them, that in the long run the correlation of forces would shift in favor of socialism, that conflict would end with the victory of socialism, that the socialist mode of production was superior to that of capitalism, that the national liberation movements would bring about states with anti-imperialist, non-capitalist, and ultimately socialist orientation, that class relations are the determining factor of international relations, and that nationalism would wither away. So effectively the idea, like with the original Koronat-Zatzir idea, pushing back against Russification, is that nationalism is fundamentally antithetical to the core principles of Marxist world revolution. The increasing gap between ideology and reality, and the decline in effectiveness of the Soviet system, did not lead to a withering away of the state or of nationalism, but rather of the attractiveness of the Soviet model of development. The ensuing crisis of ideology affected all areas of international politics. It was evident first and foremost in the highly developed industrialized world, that is, Western Europe, the United States, and Japan, but it also pervaded Central Eastern Europe and the countries of the Third World. In Western Europe in the late 1970s, principles of individualism, pluralism, democracy, and the market economy, and an active civil society clashed with the communist ideas of monolithic politics and society as a centrally planned economy. The communist parties in Western Europe, in order to enhance their influence and chances to win power, increasingly began to distance themselves from the Soviet model and develop a new body of thought under the heading of Euro-communism. The Italian and Spanish, much less so the French, but also other smaller European communist parties subscribed to it. The development in the international communist movement was vehemently opposed by Soviet ideologists. By the end of the 1980s, in part as a result of Soviet measures, but also because of a significant credibility gap between the communist parties and mainstream political and socio-economic forces, Euro-communism in Western Europe had run its course. Even the traditionally strong communist parties of Italy and France found themselves faced with a serious decline in their electoral strength. Of course, in Western Europe, in Italy, we're talking about you can say the normalization of Italian politics after the years of lead, and in France, Francois Mitterrand's outflanking of the communists from the right with the ascent of the Socialist Party. In other Western European countries, things remained as unsatisfactory as ever from the Soviet perspective. In West Germany, for instance, the German Communist Party continued to receive less than 1% of the vote in the Bundestag and Länder parliamentary elections, and thus failed to gain representation at both the federal and the state level. It thus had no measurable influence in West German political life, outside, it should be noted, from various intrigues such as that which brought down Willy Brandt's government in 1974. In Central and Eastern Europe, Soviet ideology had never taken root. The communist regimes in the countries of this area suffered from the defects of having come to power and been kept there by Soviet armed forces. Society in that region was perennially affected by Western viruses, leading to infections such as socialism with a human face and market socialism. Socialism with a human face being coined by Dubček in Czechoslovakia, and market socialism being the slogan of the Federal Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia. Moscow was able to suppress acute flare-ups of the disease, but unable to provide a cure. The last cycle from Moscow's perspective, political pathology required strong curative medicine, had been the case with Prague Spring and Czechoslovakia, necessitating the Warsaw Pact's intervention. Some returned from the acute to a latent state of revisionist disease that had taken place in the country in the early 1970s. However, not least a result of the CSE's final act of 1975 and the activities of the Helsinki groups, serious remissions occurred in the CSSR and throughout Eastern Europe. In Poland, the outbreak in 1980 was especially serious and proved to have serious consequences, also for the German problem. To put developments in Poland and their effects on the Soviet Empire in Eastern Europe in perspective, according to orthodox Soviet definition, antagonist contradictions could exist and crises could occur only in capitalist systems, as I mentioned before regarding the irony underpinning the ideological sort of stability of these systems. Andropov, in his position as General Party Secretary, still adhered to this dogma, but he at least admitted, yes, we do experience contradictions as well as difficulties. To think that this could be different would be abandoning safe, even though harsh, realities. History had taught the contradictions that by their nature are non-antagonistic could produce serious collisions if they are not taken into consideration. Several theorists went beyond the ideological euphemism, still absurdity of drawing a distinction between contradictions that cannot be solved at all and contradictions that cannot be solved in theory but not in practice. Can be solved in theory but not in practice. To them, as the crisis of Poland had shown, it was nonsense to stick to the theory of Pleshtiki proshlogo, that simply remnants of the past were responsible for acute problems. The remnants, the enduring nature of capitalist systems, which is a fundamental part of some of the better sort of Soviet historiography. So, for example, in East Germany, the lingering elements of Prussian Junkerism. In Poland, of course, it being far more visible in terms of the endurance and power and the effects of John Paul II with the Catholic Church there. And indeed, you can say that this is actually underpinning communist regimes in Romania to an extreme with protochromism, the idea that Romania is an eternal idea. Romania invented everything that was worth inventing. And indeed, its borders were eternally defined as well. So there were elements indeed that there were repudiations of aspects of the Soviet Empire and the adoption of certain aspects of nationalism in Romania, Catholicism in Poland, and market enterprise in Hungary. You had this cynical and you can say, like in the Soviet Union, stagnant normalization under Hushak, and really only Bulgaria represented some sort of unwavering fidelity to the Soviet model and loyalty to the Communist Party in Moscow. It was more appropriate, in their view, to look at the policies of the local communist parties, which could produce political crises with all of its danger for socialism. The ideological failures were equally momentous in the Third World. In the 1960s, it has seemed to Soviet ideologists and political leaders that the rapidly accelerating processes of decolonization would set the newly independent ex-colonial countries on a non-capitalist path of development in internal system structure and on an anti-Western course. From Moscow's vantage point, to accelerate the process, it had appeared expedient to provide aid to the so-called national liberation struggle. But whereas it turned out the Soviet support could occasionally decide the question, the Soviet Union was incapable of contributing meaningfully to the long-term socio-economic development of the countries concerned. And again, this doesn't simply go back to ideological considerations with the Soviet model and the desire to replicate that system, but also the hard power considerations of geopolitics and Russia's position fundamentally as a land empire as embodied in the Soviet Union. More often than not, after a period of cooperation with Warsaw Pact countries in the security field, the new states turned to the West for development aid. Furthermore, Moscow's overestimation of the importance of the Third World in East-West competition contributed to the extension, overcommitment, and rising costs of empire in the late 1970s and early 1980s. It is interesting, though, to consider the prevalent force of Third Worldism in terms of the foreign policy makers within Russia. Indeed, I don't believe it's something that has ever been abandoned, albeit it's simply been transmitted and eschewed the guise of Marxism-Leninism, but it remains a potent force. Nevertheless, I can't really develop this idea without going completely off track and talking about Russian foreign policy as of 2024. As for the costs of empire to underpin its crumbling ideological basis, significant sums of money were wasted for an endless procession of visiting communist dignitaries, their medical treatment in special hospitals in Moscow, vacations in Sochi, and hunting trips in Siberia, despite the fact that these dignitaries often had no more than a nuisance value in their own countries. In fact, the smaller and more unimportant the party, the greater its profession of loyalty to Moscow. And this, of course, actually would be consistent with any institution in terms of it being dependent as opposed to trying to represent a actionable program for attaining power. This was noted also by Gorbachev, even before he became chief of the Communist Party and embarked on a major revision of Soviet ideology. We have to ask ourselves, why is it that influential and strong parties separate themselves from us, whereas the small and insignificant parties remain orthodox and faithful to Moscow? Such pertinent questions, it would seem, are an illustration of a more general malaise felt by Soviet leaders and part of their realization that the international communist movement had turned from an asset into a liability. Indeed, as Vadim Medvedev, head of the party's Department for Relations with Communist and Workers' Parties from 1986 to 88 observed, in retrospect, whereas earlier world socialism in theory and practice had exerted a powerful influence in world affairs, at the end of the 1970s, the beginning of the 1980s, its development stopped, which contrasted sharply with the rapid progress achieved in the West and among some newly industrializing countries. Now, the impact of the worldwide socialist movement and its ensuing distance from the Soviet model, indeed the decline of communist fortunes electorally in France and Italy especially, this was a red flag to the Soviet leadership, of course, in terms of motivating the prospect of reform, and that perestroika would not only re-energize the communist system within the Soviet Union, but the perestroika could actually make the Soviet model more attractive, I believe, to external communist parties. Because looking back to Stalin, Stalin was aware of the global nature of the communist struggle, and his solution was to infiltrate and control these parties as an extension of the NKVD and the security apparatus, infiltrating these organizations such as during the Spanish Civil War and liquidating opponents, mainly Trotskyist, often bringing them over in order to eliminate them, or as Adamite has used the euphemism of uh, I forgot now. I'm being such an idiot. Not physical removal, physical liquidation. Yes, that's the right term. So on the one hand, you have the totalitarian model of control through terror, which was Stalin's mantra. But of course, given, you can say, the thinking, the passivity of the Soviet regime as we get into Brezhnev, and indeed we talk about the Brezhnev doctrine, but by the 1980s, the idea of military intervention in the Eastern Bloc was seen as increasingly taboo even before Gorbachev. And indeed, the poor state of communist parties in the world again is seen as indicative that the Soviet Union cannot suffer a continued loss of prestige if it cannot obtain loyalty to Moscow. Other than through hard power, through infiltration, coercion, and terror, then the only way that the Soviet system can regain all of these fellow travelers of social democracy, labor, Trotskyism, and indeed Marxists of all varieties, the only way to do it was by currying favor, both from socialists within the Soviet Union and without. So, what I'm making the case here is, as with Andropov, either we can see an intensification of terror or we can see an attempt to win hearts and minds. Um, the latter, of course, is very idealistic, and this actually is an important note regarding revolutions in Russia as a whole. Russia has a very unique and violent history when it comes to top-down reformers. In many instances, they tend to bring the country to the point of destruction. Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Formidable, Ivan the Terrible is an obvious example. Ivan the Terrible established the Tsarist system in Russia through the creation of the Oprichnina, the terror directed at the boyar nobility class, and with an external struggle in the Livonian Wars against the Baltic nations, Sweden and Poland, Lithuania. And in that system, he devastated the country. And in the aftermath of his death, as a result of his succession crisis, he led the country down the path to civil war. Yet the Tsarist system remained and it consolidated in the 17th and 18th century. In the 18th century, Peter the Great attempts a technological revolution, trying to bring the Russian Empire into economic and cultural, technological parity with the West by importing uh, German experts, by creating St. Petersburg, the window on the West. And in the process, the country is again almost brought to its knees by war and aspects of a serf and indeed slave economy to build this great window on the West. This policy, of course, has continued through Alexander II with the abolition of serfdom from above. In many ways, though, I believe this was a fundamentally statist and cynical mold, even though Russia, St. Petersburg society, was infected by faddism of every variety, from hardcore sort of agrarian narodniks to Western sort of French originated socialist wanting to create communes in Russia and all the sort of bizarre ideological remnants coming out of that. But the point is, Alexander II was a great reformer. He abolished serfdom and he was able to expand the scope of the Russian army through direct universal conscription. When it comes to the later Soviet model, of course, Stalin took the model which had been inherited from Lenin, and as many critics to the left of Stalin would tell you, he represented a Thermidorian reaction. He represented a purge of the sort of more the truer elements of the Marxist and indeed the Leninist project in terms of being able to bring the Soviet Union into consistency with the Tsarist system in terms of embodying some sort of red Russian empire, and with Stalin himself representing the red Tsar. So all projects towards reform in many ways embody this aspect of a fundamental crisis of the system, a threat to the very existence of the state. And in all of these instances, it brought ruin, but Russia was ultimately able to consolidate, as with Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, Alexander II, and Stalin, and come out stronger despite the turmoil and the struggle. So, why was it so disastrous with Gorbachev, I have to ask, even though Gorbachev doesn't seem to be so much of an aberration when you take all of these things into consideration. The fact that the economic downturn in the 1980s brings home the reality of the Soviet stagnation, its inability to reform. It is facing a consumerist struggle, a market struggle, a materialist struggle, and it needs to compete with the West on those terms. It has lost the campaign for even holding, essentially being the leader of leftism throughout the rest of the world, and so it needs to regain that constituency. And Gorbachev's revolution, perestroika, and glasnost could almost be seen to be consistent with all this idea of winning back the left internationally and rebuilding the position of the Soviet Union to reinvigorate socialism. And this is Adamite on Gorbachev's new thinking. The Gorbachev revolution began with only minor revisions of theory, but ended in the complete replacement of the ideological and imperial paradigm. The then party leader and his chief advisors have acknowledged the gradual and essentially unplanned progression of change. It would be a great exaggeration to say that we envisaged from the very beginning the scope and difficulties of perestroika, Gorbachev had explained in retrospect. Its initial designs, furthermore, did not go beyond the framework of the system, neither ideologically nor politically. For us, it was then that matter of improving the existing society, forcing the system to work. Similarly, Yakovlev remembers that at the beginning we had little idea where events would take us. There was only a general understanding of what needed to be cast aside. The general understanding, however, is precisely what explains the progressive, in its ultimate scope, unintended dismantling of the ideological and imperial paradigm and its replacement by the new thinking. As in the left and right dichotomy of traditional Marxist-Leninist approaches, an inner logic existed that linked a set of policies of either one or the other orientation in domestic and foreign policy. To illustrate this abstraction by example, Brezhnev's approach to détente was bound to fail because of dual violation and logic of interconnectedness. Just to find other examples of this. So détente with the West is followed by a system of internal consolidation following the elimination of the Dubček regime in 1968. So there is an ideological inconsistency there. You can almost say an inherent contradiction, in the same way that Stalin was able to refute aspects of the ideology of Lenin by saying that the new economic policy was fundamentally at odds with the construction of socialism within the Soviet Union, leading to his aggressive pursuit of collectivization and the creation of a planned economy. So economics, foreign policy, all of these things need to be consistent with the fundamental tenets of socialist utopian world building. And for Gorbachev in particular, when he rises to power on the reformist agenda following the demise of the circulation of septuagenarian elites, we see the dismissal of this figure on the top right, Gromko. He had been at the helm of Russian foreign policy for 25 years. Indeed, he had been responsible for the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, which had proven to be a disaster, which Gorbachev attempted to rescue himself from. But the removal of Gromko proved that Gorbachev believed in ideological revision, perestroika in all aspects of policy, from the economy to the official ideology of the party and to foreign policy. And he failed in all of these respects. But so essentially was the scope of his ambition, such as also the scope of his unmitigated failure. As a repressive policy at home contradicted an ostensible policy of opening in foreign policy, in the foreign policy realm, rejection of interference in internal affairs of socialist countries, notably in Eastern Europe, a vigorous arms build-up and support for national liberation movements did not square well with attempts to improve East-West economic exchanges and gain access to Western technology, credits, and know-how. Again, we're talking about a fundamental inequality economically and technologically. And part of this program is also in terms of ingratiating the Soviet system with the West, deepening the process of detente. And this is done for the sake of self-interest of the Soviet Union in terms of being able to legitimate itself by buying off its populations with consumer goods, which had been de facto the policy in Eastern Europe, and again representative of a German, West German soft power. The theoreticians of the new paradigm recognized such deficiencies and realized the effectiveness of new approaches depended upon coherence and consistency. What then were the main ingredients of Gorbachev's new thinking? The new paradigm included the following major principles. The use of military power, geopolitical expansionism, and empire building are outdated forms of international conduct. They impose significant costs and impede socio-economic development. So cost reduction is one fundamental thing that the Soviet military empire, despite being essential in terms of the preservation of the Soviet system and the legitimation of the victory in World War II, is fundamentally at odds in terms of being able to redirect those resources towards economic development in terms of being able to facilitate this catch up. Indeed, as inherent in the logic of the Soviet empire post 1960 decolonization, America was very successful in terms of being able to create de facto vassals in the European Union and indeed in the wider world, i.e., states that were militarily occupied or rather enabled American presence and were economically dependent. But the United States didn't have to resort to such blatant and ridiculous measures such as the Soviet Union in terms of the intervention in 1956 and the intervention in 1968. And thereby you can say that the American policies consistent with decolonization ideologically and economically abetted and buttressed the system, whilst the Soviet Union was dependent in terms of being able to intensify the occupation and the perpetuation of a formal internal empire and an external empire. And so there is a fundamental contradiction in terms of being able to cultivate internal and worldwide support for socialism. And so a policy of peace from Gorbachev's point of view would seem to augment this. Status and power in international affairs are determined by qualitative indicators such as the effectiveness of the political system, economic efficiency, and the ability to adapt to rapid scientific technological process. Again, just rather sort of conservative programs about technological innovation being able to aid and abet political goals of an effective administration. That, of course, is consistent with Andropov's thinking. So Gorbachev really isn't innovating in the sense that he wants the Soviet Union to be better administered and more economically and technologically advanced. The internal resources of a nation, including a high level of education and technical skill of the population, as well as the country's quality and way of life, are important factors of international influence, again, winning hearts and minds. Interests in world affairs are to be promoted through multilateral approaches and participations in international institutions. This also applies to security, which cannot be safeguarded unilaterally through the application of military technical means, but only political and cooperatively. Now, this is essentially the elimination of the Cold War as a foreign policy format, the idea of looking at the Soviet Empire as a fortress, the fortress of socialism, which is assaulted by capitalist projects on all sides. This is by far, you can say, the most radical deviation of Gorbachev from the policies of his predecessors. And in terms of trying to find a precedent, the precedent actually comes, I believe, in terms of reading this from America, in the attempts of FDR in trying to cultivate good relations with the Soviet Union during World War II and trying to actively bring the Soviet Union in terms of the participation in new multilateral systems such as the United Nations. And of course, Stalin went along with that so long as he was able to inflate the Soviet Union's power within such institution by giving Belarus and Ukraine their own seats, and of course, making Russia, Soviet Union, a member of the Security Council. But this seems to be Gorbachev taking the example of FDR and making friendly overtures to the West. There is, again, like I said, fundamental self-interest there in terms of being able to lean economically on the West, which is a representative of the Soviet Union's sort of dependence on Western credits, and you can say increasing debt. Again, the needs of consumerism, but like I said, this would be an elimination of the Cold War. And it has many implications in terms of the Soviet Union being able to buttress its own internal empire. If it's opening, a hand of friendship to the West, if it's reaching out, how much the Soviet Union need to sacrifice in order to buy in to the Western system. Although the nation state continues to be an important organizing principle in the international system, nationalism is one of the many forms of unilateralism that needs to be replaced by a process of integration. Of course, that's just consistent Soviet policy from the beginning. The main actors and factors of stability in the international system are the industrialized countries, which adhere to a common system of values, laws, and norms. Now, this point sounds banal. It sounds like anything that would come from any major sort of foreign policy minister of any country, regardless of ideological orientation. And the whole creation of a law of a rules-based system. And this again sort of creates a crisis of sort of intellectual orthodoxy. Because on the one hand, I'm trying to say that there is a logic in perestroika in terms of Gorbachev trying to bring the forces of the international left into support of a rejuvenated and reformed Soviet system. But if we talk of a common system of values, laws, and norms, what does that say about the distinction of the Soviet system of values versus the Western system of values? In other words, not only is the Soviet Union purchasing into the Western system for the purposes of economic aid and development, but the Soviet Union is also compromising their own ideological leftist distinctiveness. And maybe that's an attempt by Gorbachev to be able to influence the politics of Western nations. But as we actually see, it turns out to be a elimination of the Soviet system. So it seems incredibly naive if you were to operate on that system and believe the Soviet Union can gain a similar purchase to the United States, given the fact that the Cold War was always a unfair competition. The main factors of instability and threats to world peace are nationalism, ethnic conflict, religious fundamentalism, political extremism, migration, terrorism, and environmental catastrophes. And again, with the exception of migration, all of those facets are just banal reiterations of any politician, what any sort of political system, nation, foreign minister would have said in the last sort of 30 years up until this day, which again means the Soviet Union is effectively trying to replicate and ingratiate itself, but like I said, with common system of values at what cost? To explain and provide some detail about the evolution of the new paradigm, the first and the foremost realization was that a close interrelationship between domestic and foreign policy, and as time went by, the priority of domestic over foreign policy. Statements made by Gorbachev himself reflect the progression of the viewpoints. In an interview with Time magazine, he remarked, "Somebody said that foreign policy is a continuation of domestic policy. If that is so, then I ask you to ponder one thing. If we in the Soviet Union are setting ourselves such grandiose plans in the domestic sphere, perestroika, then what are the external conditions that we need to be able to fulfill these domestic plans? I leave the answer to that question with you." In February of 1987, he said, "Our international policy is determined more than ever by our domestic policy, by our interest in concentrating on creative work for the perfection of our country. For that very reason, we need more stable peace, predictability, and constructive direction of international relations." There is another aspect of significance to the relationship between domestic and foreign policy in the Gorbachev era. Reflecting in his memoirs on the felt necessity at the beginning of his tenure in office to embark upon fundamental changes in foreign policy. He explains that perestroika, domestic affairs, and in foreign policy realm took shape only gradually. Success in one area had a positive effect on the other, whereas correspondingly failures put a brake on the development in both areas. A central point to be made at the outset, however, is that the trial and error process had its limits. Gorbachev was not so much of a conceptual thinker. To the extent that he adhered to abstractions, he remained wedded to utopian ideas. Reform socialism and socialism with a human face in the political realm, and in economics, the harmonization of the plan with the market. Fundamental reconceptualization, both in domestic and foreign policy, was urged upon him, in part by events and in part by advisers who had a keener intellectual bent and greater analytical potential. Reconceptualization of domestic and foreign policy meant not simply creatively adapting, but abandoning Marxist-Leninist ideology. The necessity for taking such a momentous decision was understood by hardly anyone in a position of responsibility at the beginning of the Gorbachev era, but it was clearly stated in the midst of change by Soviet dissidents who had emigrated to the West. Ideology is the hard core of the Soviet system that does not allow the country to deviate too far for too long. Unless the central ideological tenets were changed, Soviet strategy would remain imprisoned by its assumptions. If the Soviet leadership was really serious about radical change, they concluded, it would have to begin by discarding the ruling ideology. So, like I said, all of this seems to be consistent with domestic reform, reflecting on the idea to represent socialism with a human face in terms of being able to reform international relations and aid and abet in terms of the Soviet uh, policies towards consumerism. But it raises an important question here, is that many commenters in the West from a very early, from the 1920s, observed that the Soviet Union was a disaster, that it would not lead to the creation of communist utopianism. Indeed, this goes back to the early debates in the Democratic Socialist Party between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks concerning the gradual Marxist doctrinaire approach of waiting for the capitalist countries to collapse per their own internal contradictions and to allow for the historical eschaton of socialism to win essentially through the revolution of the proletariat. In vanguard Leninism, we see the operation of the party as bringing about the revolution from above with a core of hardened revolutionaries. But of course, this is fundamentally at odds with you can say, the inevitable approach of Marxism as being that of essentially of an economic and social process rather than a political process being led by a cadre of a core elite around Lenin. And this is the bedrock essentially of Leninism. As a result of this, and the fact that the party remained, the party did not relinquish its power to the Soviets. Rather, the party desired to consolidate its position, and indeed, the Communist Party was an essential component of the communist system. And under Stalin, the party subordinated all other aspects of political life to central party control. What this effectively means is that the Soviet Union never lost the core adherence to the rule of the vanguard. This is the idea of democratic centralism. You have a core of a collective leadership, but once they make a decision, all other party apparatchiks have to follow the line. They have to be disciplined. They have to follow the party hierarchy. In many ways, you can say that this represents a religious orthodoxy, ideological conformity. So the minute you impose a fundamental sort of ideological tremor into the system, breaking the presumptions of a party who are all predicated upon these inherited ideas. And in terms we talk about a self-interested elite as well. There are material incentives as well as ideological incentives to keep the system going as it exists in its current iteration. But instigate such radical reform and the whole basis, the ideological foundation, the political foundation of the party deviating from orthodoxy begins to collapse. And to Western observers, perhaps it was more obvious than to Gorbachev himself, albeit I do find this remarkable. And you can say the incompetence of Gorbachev does lead perhaps to the conclusion that this was almost a system of design sabotage, but there we are. But we can't talk about perestroika without also talking about glasnost, because these are two sides of the same coin. And glasnost is essential in terms of understanding what I've just discussed here, which is the perils of deviation from ideological orthodoxy and the implications that has from Leninism, the creation of the Leninist vanguard, and creating core adherence to a centrally determined Marxist ideology. Glasnost, which means effectively transparency, remained mostly a slogan, and I do have to make this point because the eccentric tripper, yes, it's a college of cardinals or a synod of bishops. In many ways, yes, I would agree with this notion. I think it's why many people despise the Catholic Church. They look at the Soviet model and they look at the Catholic model, and they believe it's inherently totalitarian. The Catholic priests are responsible for maintaining orthodoxy. They're responsible for preventing the laity from falling into error, and they take their cue from the papacy, who himself is surrounded by the College of Cardinals and is elected from their ranks. There are consciously elements of this. But again, why I believe the Soviet Union was doomed ideologically is because it is fundamentally a materialist ideology. And of course, the Catholic system has far more purchase because it is anti-materialistic. It is promising that through adherence to and membership of the Catholic Church and being true to the way of Christ, you are going to receive eternal salvation in the next life. Whereas the Soviet system promises an earthly utopia. In other words, something is more tangible and obvious when it fails than the other. You can take, you can take a completely atheistic point of view and still accept that the Catholic Church offers something which is far more intangible, and therefore you can say far more seductive than the Soviet Union, which only has a legacy of failure in terms of being able to realize its materialistic core. But there are definitely parallels. But of course, one is far more sort of ideologically enduring than the other. If I'm going to completely look at this from a value-free relativistic point of view, there are certainly parallels to make. It's not that much of an original assumption. Glasnost remained mostly a slogan right through 1986. Even geographical locations that could be indicated on Soviet maps were still not being shown inaccurately to foil foreign spies, as if satellite imaging had not been invented, while many cities were entirely missing. Uh, Russia's long lauded history of Potemkin villages. So, of course, this indicates an aspect which I hadn't really considered beyond ideological orthodoxy, which is the idea that in order to economically develop and implement policies better, people need to know where resources are. They need to know where cities are. But of course, in a closed society, which has actually been determined by a vast internal security apparatus, and you're focused on the idea of international and internal sabotage for a variety of reasons, either local ideological subversion or hostile sort of foreign agents. If your system is fundamentally built on this idea of fortress socialism and the notion of endemic paranoia, then this is going to confound the earnest attempts at reform. If only a few people at the top are privy to all the facts, and a centrally planned economy simply cannot operate in a system of secrecy. Indeed, we're talking about the planned economy as it exists already being ineffective. Add hypersecurity into that, and you make it even more absurd and unwieldy in terms of being able to properly manage. Widespread fictitious economic accounting was foiling planners to the point that the KGB employed its own spy satellites to ascertain the size of the Uzbek cotton harvest. But the spy agency itself suffered from internal falsifications. And of course, there's also political implications of this in terms of trying to stymie the efforts of various other departments, ministries, and even petty rivalries within the political system. You know, going back to the period of 1930s and the ideas of local Communist Party officials, faking production quote targets which have been met, etc. There is an inbuilt incentive due to the power structure within the Soviet Union to falsify and to lie, which clearly doesn't help the planned economy. Clearly, some measure of openness was needed for the operation of the system, let alone for people's dignity. This became very painfully clear in April of 1986, when the world's worst nuclear catastrophe at Chernobyl demonstrated the depth of the Soviet Union's problems and the dangers, as well as the increasing impossibility of secrecy. The radiation cloud, I mean, it'll be interesting to see the Soviet Union continuing this policy with Google Maps. Which made a mockery of the reflexive denials by Soviet officials, forced a tragic breakthrough. In autumn and winter of 1986-87, the Soviet media, with the General Secretary's encouragement, set out to demonstrate an imperative for change by seizing upon the issue after issue that had been taboo: the abortion epidemic, poverty, drug addiction, the Afghan war, Stalin-era plays, and the books were unblocked, galvanizing the support of the intelligentsia. Now, this is interesting. During the 1950s, there was a baby boom, partly because so many Soviets had died during the Second World War. But by the 1970s, this seems to be endemic to all socialist systems, and this is why we had the one-child policy under Deng Xiaoping in the 1980s. The Soviets reach a certain population, and then they have to consider central planners and the capacity to feed their own population. And collective farming and the fundamental inefficiencies regarding the state farms and the collective farms mean that the Soviet Union does not have an abundance, despite its plethora of access to wheat and livestock and other farming perks and assets. So abortion is a very convenient method in terms of being able to reduce the population. And of course, there are other things which aren't so convenient for the Soviet system, like alcoholism. On the one hand, psychologically, alcoholism allows you to cope with the stagnant and you can say joyless life of living as a person without prospects outside of sort of the growth of the party, rising your way through the party and having a small apartment and the possibility of a TV, a refrigerator, and a very large and heavy car, which is nothing in terms of comparison with Western manufacturing. But therefore, there is a moral imperative behind what Gorbachev is doing with Glasnost. And this, like I said, in terms of not being entirely innovative, is inspired by the anti-corruption campaigns of his political forebear and patron, Andropov, albeit Gorbachev is taking it to a new radical extreme in terms of making this a policy of openness and you can say self-reformation in terms of trying to encourage the population to abandon these vices, as opposed to Andropov being able to determine this through state institutions. In terms of being able to understand this, there was also a more insidious aspect behind Chernobyl. Chernobyl, of course, represents the worst aspects of the Soviet system of internal security and the need for Glasnost. So it's actually a political asset for Gorbachev, as Kotkin makes clear here. But it also serves as a political bargaining chip within his feud with the other Communist Party officials. In Ukraine, which is where Chernobyl is located, the leader of the Ukrainian Communist Party, because all of the 15 constituent republics, with the exception of Russia, have their own communist parties. The Ukrainian Communist Party featured disproportionately within the power system of the Soviet Union throughout its entire history. But the Communist Party there was resistant to perestroika. Its leader was particularly conservative and corrupt, and essentially, you can see perestroika as part of an ongoing power struggle within the entire apparatus of the Soviet Union Communist Party. Gorbachev attempting to wrestle control from these Brezhnev-era cadres, you can see in the grey, and obviously that's an aesthetic choice I've employed there. Um, then also this has the effect of dividing the communist parties in the periphery for myriad reasons, whether reformist or conservative, from the central administration of the Communist Party. So on the one hand, Gorbachev is tactically devious, being able to exploit the Chernobyl disaster in terms of wrecking the Communist Party leadership in Ukraine and in terms of promoting his own policy of glasnost. But of course, in the midterm and the long term, this has disastrous ramifications for the Soviet Union's longevity and Gorbachev's own political situation. Is conservative the right word to use to describe communist? Like I said, I believe that the left-right dynamic is by far the most effective in terms of being able to understand leftist systems. It doesn't really work when describing I would say sort of truly reactionary positions at all. The right wing doesn't work. And conservative in a literal sense is very appropriate. We're talking about a group of septuagenarians who are trying to conserve the Soviet Union as it then existed in the 1970s and the early 1980s, whereas Gorbachev is trying to radically redefine the position of the Soviet Union within the broad scheme of domestic and indeed international leftism. So within the system, again, like a Dubček, he is presenting himself as a leftist and a radical leftist against the quote unquote conservative faction within the Soviet Union, just to clarify those terms. Long banned films, plays, and books were unblocked, galvanizing the state plays. And again, this is a feature which links back to very early sort of Khrushchev era debates against the Stalinists, Trotsky against and representing the left opposition against Stalinism. There is an inherent sort of factional war going on within the entire sort of leftist power struggle within the Soviet Union and outside of it. And so this simply represents another form of factionalism, albeit rather than Gorbachev trying to tack to the center, Gorbachev begins his career in power by targeting and trying to eliminate people resisting his reform by attacking the old loyal cadres of Brezhnev. And of course, this seems to be tactically a brilliant maneuver, but of course, it's very short sighted. Long banned films, plays, and books were unblocked, galvanizing the state supported intelligentsia. Each step fanned speculation about how far it would go. With Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, a literary indictment of the entire Soviet system, including Lenin, see the light of day? It did. That so much had been hidden and banned greatly magnified the reaction to each new offering in what was, after all, the official Communist Party media. Non-state news sheets were started, but their circulation remained minuscule. The weekly newspaper, Argument and Facts, launched in the late 1970s, achieved a circulation above 30 million during Perestroika, the most of any paper in the world, and its editors received 5,000 to 7,000 letters per day. The exhilaration, truth, was widely and deeply felt. By 1989, however, readers' letters bespoke the profound disillusionment characteristic of defectors. What sort of government is it that allows only selected people to live normal lives? Wrote MF from the city of Kharkov. Why is it that people in authority have everything, flat statures and money, while we have nothing? I am a simple woman. I used to believe in our government. Now I no longer believe. A teenager warned not to let our young people go to our capitalist countries. Why? I had the chance to go to the United States on an exchange basis. I used to be a true patriot of our country, and I turned into something really horrible. I became a human being. Glasnost turned into a tsunami of unflattering comparisons because of past censorship, the obsession with the capitalist world, and the intelligentsia's apocalyptic inclinations. It beat itself into hysteria with a competition to appear the most radical. The Smash Friday night television variety show, The Viewpoint, portrayed the Soviet realm as utterly destitute and exploited, while the West came across as paved with gold and unreservedly free. A print journalist who had written one of the fiercest anti-American diatribes prior to 1985 became the editor of the mass circulation illustrated magazine, The Flame, and promptly turned it into the most widely read source of investigative reporting and exaggerated pro-Americanism. Grisly new details about the communist repressions further undermined the allegiance to socialism and raised moral dilemmas. Mass graves were described by the very policemen who had dug them. Prosecutors who had destroyed innocent people were still on the job or enjoyed comfortable retirements, while their victims were dead or suffered meager positions. While their journalists, who had hounded enemies for anti-Soviet agitation, now hastened to publish those views. All previous life was revealed as a lie. Under Khrushchev, the revelations had come to a generation of Stalinists, people who saw the formerly concealed information not as discrediting socialism, but as discrediting Stalin, and inspiring them to a renewal of socialism to return to its Leninist roots. At least initially, that's how much of the Khrushchev generation interpreted Gorbachev's glasnost. Indeed, in economics and politics, many of the other ideas that came forward have first been developed in the 1960s, again, going back to Kosygин's economic reforms. But soon, the same process that had targeted Stalin began desanctifying Lenin, and by extension, the entire legitimacy of the Soviet system. A tiny group calling itself the Democratic Union, one of the new informals of civic associations that had risen, invited arrest by declaring itself a political party against the communist monopoly, waving the red, white, and blue flag of the pre-Bolshevik 1917 revolution and demanding the restoration of private property and the bourgeois order. Their appeals reached few people, but indicated the suicidal dynamic of openness for the system. So Glasnost, you can say, is fine in terms of a concept, in terms of being able to administer these projects better. Indeed, you can say the basis behind it beyond simple administrative efficiency, and indeed transparency within a fundamentally corrupt and opaque political process, there needs to be a stop to it. There needs to be a line which cannot be crossed. And Gorbachev failed completely in terms of being able to delineate that line. And so the calls to reform became more excessive. And indeed, as Gorbachev had followed the winds of change to increase his own power base by becoming more extreme in his, you can say, denunciation of the ineffectiveness of the stagnation period of the Soviet Union. So that whole mantra of being able to obtain power and sustain himself in his reformist zeal goes over to more radical people who are beginning to question, why is the Communist Party leading this process to reform? Why can this process not be democratized? And so what does he do? He democratizes the Soviet Union, and this further discredits the Communist Party. I mean, far less radical measures have been taken under Khrushchev. Khrushchev had attempted to attack the hereditary state of the Soviet aristocracy, as has been outlined here by Adamite, by creating term limits for party officials. And this was one of the reasons why he was ousted by the Brezhnev clique. So Gorbachev is so vehement in his opposition to that clique because he believes that they can potentially depose him in the way that they deposed Khrushchev. Of course, him coming to his sort of acute political consciousness as one of the generation of Khrushchev apparatchiks. So there is, again, a logic underpinning his actions, but at the same time, he is creating a momentum from which he cannot control not only the ideological momentum behind this movement, but also the political momentum behind this movement. He is eliminating one alternative castle to his authority, but he is creating another. Um, Sort of no enemies to the left would be an effective mantra for him to adopt here. And of course, Stalin was able to avoid this complete sort of fall into factionalism by mass slaughter and terror. And indeed, Andropov believed that any policy regarding the sort of moral rejuvenation, quote unquote, of the Soviet Union had to be accompanied by a massive increase in the repressive and interventionist powers of the security state, whereas Gorbachev believed you can achieve both whilst eliminating that security apparatus. And in the same extension, removing the terror which has been inspired by the KGB, which has kept most people in line, at the same underpinning the ideas that social justice had been a core feature of Soviet life, that Lenin had created something that was fundamentally positive. When you begin questioning all of these things and there's no limit in how far the questioning can go, then again, it should be self-explanatory that this earnest attempt, I believe, at being able to cultivate and re-energize the Soviet system failed, and predictably failed. I'll just continue with a few more reading segments, and then I will go over the actual chronology of disillusion. And this again is reinforcing the idea that Gorbachev was no idiot. He was exceptional in terms of his tactical ability to be able to outflank various political figures. And like I said, had Gorbachev been an agent of the West, I don't believe he would have been able to succeed in the way that Gorbachev succeeded. Gorbachev only succeeded because he was so familiar with how the Communist Party worked that he was able to eliminate so many rivals and yet create so many alternative sources of power at the same time. Gorbachev knew that far from an all-party official shared his commitment to democratizing socialism, and from the outside he had been wary of an apparat revanche, going back to the idea of Khrushchev's original removal. Behind the scenes, and again, to put this in contrast with Khrushchev was enamored by the same utopian spirit for the triumph of communism that Gorbachev ostensibly is. But Khrushchev was intelligent enough to realize that if there is a fundamental break, a flaw within the Soviet Empire, like in Hungary, that it will simply be an opening point for ideological and economic and military subversion by the West. But Gorbachev seemed to believe that you could eschew all such concerns, which is why he's such a fascinating figure. Behind the scenes, there was widespread foot-dragging, of course, but at the 1988 party plenum, Yegor Ligachev, the figure I've included on the right, actually he was featured prominently in Andropov's succession program to coincide with Khrushchev, and he ascended to power with Khrushchev, but ultimately he became one of the greatest rivals within the party. Ligachev, the number 2 official, openly argued for an end to Glasnost's wholesale blackening of the Soviet past and, by implication, of the Soviet status quo. The mood in the hall was supportive of Ligachev and his call to rein in Glasnost. The next month, as if in response, a firestorm broke over Leningrad. A schoolteacher letter to the editor of a rearguard newspaper, Nina Andreeva, I cannot compromise principles, attacked left liberals who falsify the history of socialism and try to make us believe that the country's past was nothing but mistakes and crimes, keeping silent about the greatest achievements of the past and the present. The letter appeared in print the day that Gorbachev left on a trip to Yugoslavia, and as was party custom, his place was temporarily assumed by Ligachev. After Gorbachev's return at the next Politburo meeting, the General Secretary casually brought the letter up, and as prearranged, Yakovlev condemned it as an anti-perestroika manifesto. Aspersions were cast on Ligachev and the Secretariat for overseeing the letter's publication. Analysts at the time misperceived this important turn of events as evidence of determined apparatic resistance rather than of Gorbachev's manipulation. Gorbachev writes obliquely in his memoirs that the letter contained information known only by a relatively narrow circle. Ligachev writes that Gorbachev had the circumstances of publication investigated and privately exonerated him of responsibility. Gorbachev never made a public disavowal of the suspicions. On the contrary, with the avid assistance of the Soviet and foreign media, Ligachev was made into an unwitting instrument of the General Secretary's effort to cultivate sympathies and to pressure the apparatus publicly to demonstrate that it was not anti-perestroika. Gorbachev also fashioned himself a scapegoat for economic failures. The Ligachev-led conservatives were strangling the reforms. To top it all off, He continued to enjoy Ligachev's loyalty, owing to party discipline and to insincere private exculpation. Without knowing it, Gorbachev writes with evident satisfaction, Nina Andreeva actually helped us. But his clever manipulation simply stirred up even greater popular fury at the party without magically transforming the behavior of the apparatchiks, let alone the economy. The General Secretary expended extraordinary efforts, urging all levels of the apparat that not to take risks of political reform would be even more dangerous. In 1987 to 88, he had managed to coax the Politburo into agreeing to democratize the party with competitive elections. Accustomed to lifetime appointments and prerequisites in exchange for following orders, most party officials, even those who had reformist inclinations, did not know how to address a public reconfigured as voters, nor did functionaries appreciate being held responsibly accountable for Stalin's crimes. The courageous types who heeded the call for the vanguard to lead perestroika discovered that in the absence of anticipated economic improvements, they were leading little more than angry public ventilations over hitherto unmentionable problems for which the party was being blamed. And while party members among Moscow's intelligentsia were consumed in debates on history and reform, freedom, wrote one New York Times reporter in 1988 party conference, the delegates from the provinces wanted to talk about empty stores, dirty rivers, hospitals without water, and factories with deteriorating assembly lines. Somehow the Communist Party was supposed to be both the instrument and the object of perestroika. But at the same July conference, Gorbachev, still seeking a reliable political base and levers of power, unveiled a plan to revive the Soviets. Power had been seized in the name of the Soviets, yet the councils embodying a vision like Jacobin clubs of radical direct democracy had long since atrophied. Now local Soviets were to be revived by means of contested elections, and these were to be accompanied by elections to an all-new body, a Congress of People's Deputies, which would in turn choose representatives to a thoroughly revamped USSR Supreme Soviet or working parliament. This plan, nominally only a refurbishment of existing institutions, meant moving beyond the party's hereditary power and acquiring a popular mandate, a test that the vast majority of sitting party officials who stood for election in early 1989 to the Congress failed miserably. Gorbachev exempted himself and the rest of the leadership from competitive elections, but the new political situation was evident from the seating in the Congress Hall. Except for Gorbachev, Politburo members now sat in the presidium, not in the presidium, but in the gallery off to the side. So why did Gorbachev do this? Well, democratization has the effect of eliminating opposition to perestroika. Yet at the same time, perestroika and adherence to it is insufficient in terms of being able to galvanize support given the economic downturn after 1986. So what Gorbachev probably imagined would be a way of, in his mind, with glasnost and perestroika, currying support for the reforms by removing obstinate bureaucrats, in effect has the opposite result, and it energizes opposition to the entire Communist Party. You can almost say that in terms of the logic of Gorbachev's structure, trying to understand it in terms of pure power politics, Gorbachev believes that the fear of a democratic accountability would, if anything, reinforce loyalty to the General Secretary. But like I said, all it does is increase opposition from the new democratic forces. Indeed, Gorbachev was intelligent enough to realize that he should not put himself up to a democratic mandate because he himself was to be immune, but all of those underneath him were to be susceptible to this new ability to be ousted. Of course, Khrushchev had put forward a far more minor proposal of party limits, and he had been eliminated. So Gorbachev, in many ways, was attempting to prevent his own ouster by limiting rivals for his own power within the Communist Party. But of course, the Communist Party, as Ligachev proved, was dependent on loyalty, hierarchy, fidelity to the central leadership. But so he's attacking the Communist Party to reinvigorate, you can say, the process of hierarchy, democratic centralism determined by perestroika, reform of the party by the party. Yet at the same time, he is weakening the party from below by creating an alternative source of legitimacy. In terms of also linking this back beyond the presets of modern democratic socialism, you can say that the revival of the Soviets is Gorbachev's recognition that the Leninist project was a usurpation of power, that the Communist Party, originally the Democratic Socialist Party, the Bolsheviki, and then the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, did not relinquish power when he declared all power to the Soviets. So you can say Gorbachev was trying to adhere to the principles of the original October Revolution, and yet in so doing, he eliminates the entire basis of the political power structure which had been in place since 1917. So on the one hand, you can say that there is a hard political logic to what Gorbachev is, wedded to an insane idealism regarding the potential of a democratic socialist revolution. Um, so again, just looking at this, it's actually fascinating, all of these particular facets coalescing into this disaster, which creates all the momentum to delegitimize the entire Soviet system that had been built up. If anything, this is as much a revolution against the Russian Revolution. We are eliminating the Soviet past from Lenin in order to create the Soviet Union as it should have been, socialism with a human face. But if you're going to do that, you almost need to create an entire new party from the ground up and seize power all over again, which I believe is what Gorbachev was trying to do with the Soviets. And of course, he fails to do that. And indeed, we're talking about an era in which there is ideological apathy at best and condemnation at worst for the crimes of the Soviet Union. There is an economic downturn. There is a failed competition to meet with the United States in terms of consumerism. All of these things are going on while Gorbachev is trying to energize a morally and increasingly economically bankrupt system. And now I think that's a my cue, to go to Kotkin again and read off the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Now I've hopefully set up the stage. In reformist Poland, the Solidarity opposition driven underground in late 1981 returned stronger than ever. Now, this is consistent with the idea that perestroika means revision in foreign policy, not just domestic policy. So we talk about the idea of non-intervention, but currying that, we also have the democratization of systems outside the Soviet Union. Some leaders, like Ceausescu in Romania and Honecker in East Germany, resisted it. But obviously, Poland is the litmus test as the system which has perhaps deviated most within the Eastern Bloc from Soviet imposed hierarchy as a consequence of the inability to impose rigid Moscow aligned orthodoxy in 1981, just to clarify that. The Solidarity opposition driven underground in late 1981 returned stronger than ever, and in June 1989 elections it won 99 of the 100 seats in the newly created Senate of the Upper House. Moreover, even though the Polish communists had rigged matters to guarantee themselves a parliamentary majority by allowing contestation of only 161 seats in the 400-seat parliament, Solidarity won all of them, except one. The overall communist majority ensured the election by parliament of a communist to the powerful new presidency, but the elected president, who had ordered the crackdown in 81, ended up inviting the anti-communist opposition to form a government. The reform had led to a regime capitulation for socialism. In unreforming East Germany, the outcome was the same. Tens of thousands of people fled westward to neighboring socialist countries and then applied for asylum at West German embassies. The flow increased in September 1989 after Hungary, prompted by West German credits, fully opened its borders with Austria. Again, the lure of economic soft power and joining the European Union for Gibbs. And indeed, you can say a political absolution for voluntarily repudiating the system. With popular and Soviet pressure mounting against the East German regime, someone in the GDR leadership at a bungled press conference accidentally declared foreign travel open. Crowds began dismantling the Berlin Wall. Now, actually go on YouTube and actually watch that. There is a clip of the Soviet minister. He looks either as if he has insomnia or is drunk. and he has no idea what he's doing. He declares there will be some freedom of movement, and he's asked by a member of the press what that means. And he says, "Oh, there'll be freedom of movement now." And of course, that causes complete paralysis within the uh, security, DDR. Why am I getting confused? Sorry, Deutsches Demokratische Republik. Anyway, um, and the Berlin Wall, as a result, collapses. What did Honecker want, the leader of the Socialist Unity Party in Germany? He wanted a Tiananmen Square. In 1989, in the summer of 1989, Deng Xiaoping, the leader of the Communist Party, the revisionist leader, who had been anti-Maoist, he came into power in the late 1970s, and he opened China up to Western investment. Now, this is a great what if, because Gorbachev was attempting to do something similar, opening Russia up to the global market and foreign investment. But why did China succeed and Gorbachev fail? Well, as stipulated, Gorbachev did not want to fundamentally reform into a market economy. He wanted to keep a socialist economy without prices and really without private property. But Russia already had its Rust Belt, as stated. In China, the industrial effort had failed spectacularly during the Great Leap Forward. And so China had everything to gain. It already had a good relation with the West following detente. So economic investment from the West poured in, and it allowed essentially the West to turn their own domestic industrial bases to rely on Chinese slave labor. And that in turn was far more valuable to the Western and by extension the global economy than was Russia opening up potentially its, essentially outdated but still vast manufacturing sector to compete globally. Russia didn't need investment in its industry because it already had too much industry. So the situations are really not comparable. But Deng Xiaoping combined this economically liberal policy with the Communist Party while maintaining rigid loyalty to the regime in Beijing, whereas Gorbachev did the opposite. And to Honecker's dismay, this led not only to the disbandment of, communist rule in East Germany, but the reunification of Germany. No one could figure out what the enormous Soviet military establishment was up to. It turns out that they were mostly kept out of the policy loop. Prior to 1989, according to Marshal Sergei Akromev, Gorbachev never once discussed scenarios for Eastern Europe with the Soviet military. In 1990, the brass blew their fuse, denouncing Gorbachev's surrogate, Sharavanadze. He was the replacement for Gromko we see and he was basically selected because he would follow whatever Gorbachev wanted. He was politically and inexperienced in terms of the foreign ministry, so he was the fall guy for foreign policy mistakes, because again, Gorbachev wasn't an idiot when it came to politics. For having failed to consult them at a meeting of the foreign minister failed to attend. Of course, Gorbachev had never planned to lose the bloc. Overtaken by events, he began pressing for guarantees that NATO would not absorb East Germany or expand eastwards. But in May of 1990, US President George Bush pressed the issue of German unification within NATO. 2 months later, Gorbachev presented the more cautious West German Chancellor Kohl with the gift of a phased, complete withdrawal of Soviet troops without trying to secure German neutrality. Nor could the Soviet Union's Soviet leaders save the Warsaw Pact. A foreign policy aimed at a common European home had led to the Soviet Union being ejected from Europe. It would be less than sincere, Gorbachev wrote, if I had said that I had foreseen the course of events and the problems that the German question would eventually create. Now, how could he avoid this? Well, the East German system was effectively a Russian colony, and it was also an attempt to showcase the advanced socialist system within the whole sort of schema of the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Empire. But of course, it was also a disaster because in the consumerist materialist struggle, it could not compete with West Germany, the most extreme example being East Berlin versus West Berlin. However, it also acted as the Soviet bulwark for the preservation of the buffer states between NATO and the Soviet Empire, and also the point of invasion. So it was a heavily militarized and occupied state. It was basically a military outpost. But here we have Gorbachev offering to remove the military presence there, even though it would still continue after German unification in part, which would at huge cost to the Soviet army, and essentially gift East Germany to the West and by extension NATO. Now, the prospect of giving up East Germany is not a new idea. In 1953, Lavrenti Beria had opened up the possibility of ceding East Germany to West Germany. However, there were conditions. One would be massive economic aid from the West, and the other would be Germany would become neutral. Indeed, if you go back to the policies of Stalin in 1946 and 1947, in the case of the military occupation of Germany ending, the policy was always for a neutral Germany. Stalin could not realistically create a socialist aligned Germany representing all of Germany. And so the compromise would be a no man's land in the middle of Europe, possibly following the same line as the Morgenthau line, which is to create a deindustrialized, disempowered Germany, which couldn't be a threat either to NATO or the Soviet Union. But of course, the West did not do that. They took their bulk of Germany, which was much larger than East Germany, and they consolidated it into one of the most powerful aspects of the European NATO, European Economic Community system, much to the horror of Moscow. So they had a significantly weaker bargaining chip in terms of forcing West Germany to become neutral through the gift of East Germany and all the costs that would incur from integrating the East German economy into the West German economy, given the amount of material extraction, industrial extraction that the Soviet Union had perpetrated in the form of reparations. So the idea had been touted, but it had failed. And that was part of the reason why Beria himself had been eliminated. Gorbachev here is abandoning East Germany for nothing. Not only is he withdrawing from it, not only is the aid he gets in the grand scheme of things unsubstantial, given the amount of prestige and power the Soviet Union is giving up, but the borders of socialism are declining. The Soviet Empire is pushing back, and one has to wonder again why. And it seems that every time Gorbachev makes a concession like this, again, without keeping the military in the loop, almost in spite of the military, trying to prevent again from them possibly launching a coup against him, which ultimately they would in August of 1991, there is this growing fear among the military that all of the gains of the Great Patriotic War are being ceded for nothing. This antipathy, of course, boils over in 1991. But Gorbachev's response effectively is just to keep the military out of the loop, keep making foreign policy concessions to the West while the Soviet Empire is receding. It follows the same logic that Beria had roused about the idea of Western cooperation and integration. But as we see, the West was essentially nabbing parts of the Soviet Empire, which Gorbachev contended. They were essentially costly. They were Soviet puppets. The Soviet military needs to be reduced in order to further the economic domestic development and the success of perestroika. And yet, one of the best exports of the Soviet Union were its weapons, its military hardware. The success of the Soviet army was part of the bulwark of the entire sort of Soviet system. And in removing the Eastern satellites, the Soviet army is not only retreating, but it is creating a rival power base on its doorstep, which is everything that Stalin had attempted to prevent. So, yes, you can say on the one hand, Gorbachev is democratizing the East. They are going their own way. And yet, economically and politically, because of the nature of the Soviet occupation, that way has already been determined. They will go to the West. That is where the political and economic pull is coming from, not from the Soviet Union. So it was deluded of Gorbachev to believe that the Soviets could withdraw from these areas and for East Germany, and they would opt democratically to remain part of the Soviet sphere. Indeed, hardliners like Nicolae Ceausescu, um, have held on to power in spite of the Soviet Union, and he again been the benefactor of Western aid. But even sort of anti-Soviet hardline communist Stalinist regimes like Nicolae Ceausescu collapse in the wake of the revolutions in 1989, such as the political momentum and you can say the intrigue bolstered from the West in terms of expanding the reach of American influence. So now it comes to the Soviet Empire itself, the Soviet Union, and I don't know. As you can probably tell, I reel off all this information and I'm mystified. Because on the one hand, you can talk about the integration of the Soviet economy and attempting to liberalize the Soviet market, but also trying to hold on to its buffer states out of a strategic necessity. Remove all ideology. This is about a Russian empire preventing the encroachments of the West. And yet they're abandoned. And I can only surmise is that Gorbachev is sincere when he is not construing the Soviet Union in terms of socialism in one country or as an extension of Russia, but he is seeing it as part of the utopian socialist project, something to be conducted on the world stage and not something to be confined to a Stalinist foreign policy parameter, which is focused on the preservation of hard Russian and by extension Soviet power. Anyway, that's my reading of it. The Soviet leaders' dramatic non-intervention to retain Eastern Europe should be viewed in the light not only of the USSR's mishandling of its relations with its satellites, when Gorbachev formally and unambiguously repealed the Brezhnev Doctrine, but also of France's long, futile war in Algeria and the brutal tenacity of the Dutch and Portuguese. And of course, this is referring to decolonization, the Malayan emergency, etc. I'm sure these are examples that underpin Gorbachev's beliefs, but nevertheless, such an imperial withdrawal, as has been proven and as is going on at the moment in Ukraine, has only been to the strategic detriment of the Soviet Union and by extension Russia. Domestically, the Soviet leaders' aid pitched the sacrifice of Eastern Europe as essential for improving relations with the West, since they argued which was itself imperative since the USSR could no longer afford the superpower competition. But for the Soviet military and the security establishment, now burdened with logistics of a hurried, humiliating retreat, Gorbachev's transformation of the international system meant the surrender of all the gains of the Second World War. Eastern Europe's exit from the Soviet orbit had an equally dramatic impact on the Soviet republics, which Gorbachev had unbound from the Communist Party and planned economy centralism and placed within the context of electoral politics. In March 1990, the Parliament of Lithuania voted to secede from the Union. The Estonian and Latvian parliaments declared transitional periods to independence. Though tiny, the three republics had been independent between 1918 and 1940, seemed to present a special challenge. But in June of 1990, the Russian Republic declared its sovereignty vis-à-vis Moscow, asserting the primacy of republic laws over union ones. The parliaments of Ukraine, Belarus, and newly renamed Moldova followed Russia's lead declarations of sovereignty. Armenia, radicalized by Karabakh. Now, this is the situation where Stalin had awarded Armenian territories, popular territories, to Azerbaijan, and in the wake of you can say, the revival of nationalism and democratization of the communist parties, these nationalistic feuds, as we see in the Baltic states, also the revival of independent communist parties, then democratic movements to oppose communist parties who are in any way showing fidelity to Moscow. Old ethnic conflicts are now flaring up, and this accelerates especially the process in the Caucasus of recontextualizing the relationship between the periphery and the center in Moscow. And indeed, it should be noted, as with Boris Yeltsin, that this process is also coming from the core in Russia itself. Having previously managed to appear a political centrist indispensable to all, Gorbachev now openly joined forces with the left to prepare a 500-day program for a transition to the market. A few months later, however, in mid-September of 1990, he just suddenly renounced the 500-day program and confederation plans, asking the Soviet parliament for special emergency powers, and began to add several proponents of order to his government. Accompanying Gorbachev's autumn 1990 lurch to the right, the first draft of the new Union Treaty was published. It accorded republics only limited control over enterprises and resources on their territories, maintained the primacy of Union laws, Soviet Union laws, specified Russia as the state language, and failed to mention the USSR's constitutional guarantee of secession. The draft may have appeased a disgruntled military in the KGB, but it had no prayer of winning Republic approval. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania had refused to take part in discussions about a union even before the draft's publication. The KGB publicly warned the Union republics were following an East German scenario. In January of 1991, a contingent of special forces commenced a special operation in Lithuania, resulting in 13 deaths, but the troops were quickly called off. The Soviet president, though commander-in-chief, disclaimed any involvement but failed to discipline anyone. Armenia, Georgia, and Moldova announced that they would have nothing to do with the Union, and in March of 1991, a new draft of a Union treaty restored the right to secession, piled with restrictions. But many republics did not bother to respond. The next month, Gorbachev abruptly reversed course once more, tacking back to the left, opening direct negotiations with the 9 republics still willing to consider a relationship with Moscow. But he also kept the pro-unitary state Soviet government in place. Left, right, then left and right, the zigs and zags from mid-90 to mid-91 were hard to read. Back in December of 1990, when a journalist asked whether he was moving to the right, Gorbachev had quipped, "Actually, I'm going round in circles." If anything, when mentioning earlier the idea that Gorbachev was ideologically adaptive, that he seemed to be making it up as he went along. Gorbachev never seems to have had a plan beyond the idealization. As Adamaitis stated, Gorbachev did not seem to have the conceptual or intellectual makeup in order to see an end goal or a new creation of a new form of Soviet socialism. We simply see the creation of new radical centers for reform, more democratization, more infringements upon the system, and therefore more attacks on his power. But regarding the disintegration of the Union itself, this is a fundamental extension and consequence of the attacks on the party. And what do I mean by that? Well, take Ukraine, for example. Ukraine had disproportionately influenced the affairs of the Soviet political system. Back in 1953, I believe half of the highest members of the Politburo were Ukrainian. Khrushchev had been the head of the Ukrainian party. His mentor, Kaganovich, again, was a very influential figure within the makeup of the Soviet Union. Brezhnev himself was Ukrainian. So there is a fidelity within the system of communism within the Soviet Union that within, say, for example, local communist parties like Ukraine or Georgia or Belarus, being part of the Soviet Union means opportunities for the elites, which are far beyond the prospects of these local governments, especially the smaller ones. So when Gorbachev begins attacking the Communist Party, removing the centers of its power, democratizing it, figures such as the head, Khrushchev, I believe is his name, in the Ukrainian Communist Party, look to this and say, okay, well, you have given us no incentive whatsoever to remain part of the Soviet Union. The old sort of power sharing agreement, the old spirit of the reunification with Crimea, the sort of renewal of the Treaty of Pereyaslav, the fraternal union of all these republics, having shone the Eastern European satellites and having failed, as with Lithuania, to crack down on the independence movements, his policies within Eastern Europe now being consistent with his policies within the Soviet Union itself. The only thing uniting all the ministerial functions is the Communist Party. It is the ideological and disciplined, almost sort of militarized bureaucratic bedrock behind the whole Soviet system. Remove the party, and you have a new conception of what it means to be the Soviet Union, a democratized, but that means you are creating rival constituencies from the nationalities. You have already created a rival constituency from a democratic base, but now we have figures such as Boris Yeltsin, who was a prominent Communist Party official in Sverdlovsk, far more influential than Gorbachev's Stavropol, and he becomes a effective populist leader who dramatically exits the Communist Party and leads a democratic opposition against the Soviet Union within Russia itself. So now you have a leader of Russia, which is the principal constituency of the Soviet Union, who is not a communist and is gunning for Gorbachev himself. He has created contenders for his legitimacy on all sides. And instead of, in terms of being able to create a new system around Gorbachev, Gorbachev creates an empowered Russian presidency. He creates a new sort of buffed up ministerial apparatus. Effectively, he is trying to govern through the ministries, through the institutions, through a powerful executive presidency, and through the army. And yet at the same time, he is not keeping the army in the loop and the security apparatus with the effective ability to intimidate. Obviously, there are exceptions. I mean, when it comes to Boris Yeltsin's phone was tapped. Boris Yeltsin himself claimed that the KGB had attempted to assassinate him. The security apparatus is terrible and still in effect, yet Gorbachev has used it ineffectively in terms of being able to maintain power, and he's not giving the military a free hand to deal with the separatist movements. So you can say, what is motivating this? You can say, again, this is idealism, and yet this idealism is now being thwarted at every turn by the forces that he has himself created. And as the logic had failed in Eastern Europe, the logic is now rebounding within the Soviet Union itself. Now, this is important to bring in the American position here. Because what was the American position? Well, the Americans had already gotten everything they wanted in Eastern Europe. And they were concerned that the disintegration of the Soviet Union would actually negate the effects of an economic partnership with the West. They were thinking about the long-term stability in the region. They weren't necessarily thinking about supporting the disintegration of the Soviet Union itself, so long as the Soviet Union could be an effective economic trading partner and you can say, a diplomatic and military boon. In other words, Gorbachev had already proven himself more than willing to partner to the West and offer many, many concessions. We're not just talking in terms of the secession of the satellites. We're talking about SALT, Strategic Arms Limitations Treaties. And of course, this also serviced Gorbachev's own ends. He didn't want military parity with the West. He wanted the economy to be redirected to domestic issues. And it also so happens to be consistent with the ideological aims of the strategic aims of the United States. So would it not benefit the United States to have a figure like Gorbachev leading a Soviet Union rather than allowing, as we see with Yugoslavia, all of these unpredictable elements which can go any way? And indeed, you can say the hostility directed at Russia now is again a consequence that they could not cultivate a Gorbachev-esque figure to integrate the Soviet and later the Russian systems into harmony with the West, whatever that means. In all likelihood, that would mean economic dependency more than partnership, as we've seen the gross inequalities between the Soviet economy vis-a-vis the West. But anyway, these are just my thoughts. Right. So we have the failure of the 500-day plan to reconsolidate the system. In July of 1991, there is a new treaty concerning the Commonwealth of the Republics, and indeed the terminology keeps changing. So we have Soviet Union. Is it going to be a Soviet Commonwealth? Is it going to be a Soviet Federation? Is it going to be a Soviet Confederation? The very identity has now been put on the line. And this is where we get to, finally, what Gorbachev had striven to avoid, which is a coup. 2 days before the signing ceremony of the new Union settlement on the 18th of August, in the early evening, a group of top Soviet officials arrived unsummoned at Gorbachev's Crimean dacha with a proposal for him to declare martial law. He refused. He also refused to resign outright or claim illness, and resigned temporarily in favor of his vice president, Yanev, figured in the center on the second rung. Sorry, my ability to speak is obviously leaving me at the moment. He refused. Gorbachev refused. He also refused to resign outright or claim illness, and resigned temporarily in favor of his vice president, returning healthy when the dust had settled. Rebuffed, the heads of the KGB, army, police, military industrial complex, and civilian Soviet government went forward with the illness scenario anyway. The demise of a unitary state that representing the Soviet Union in accordance with the foundation and ideology of the Communist Party had been made plain by the new text of this Union Treaty, which, hoping to cause an uproar, they had leaked to the Moscow News. The demise was also clear from Yeltsin's imperious decrees asserting the Russian Republic takeover of the valuable USSR oil and natural gas industries on Russian territory, as well as his proclamations on forming a Russian Republic KGB and a Russian Defense Ministry. So effectively, what Yeltsin is doing in terms of is not only a matter of undermining the agency and power of the Soviet president, who is his nominal superior, but Yeltsin now is in the process of directly annexing the Russian bureaucratic apparatus, and currying favor by trying to draw away various officials within the new sort of recontextualized Soviet ministries and bring them over to the Russian state system. You could almost imagine the interesting phenomena that, say, for example, Texas or California would be attempting to draw figures away from the U.S. federal government and become Texan or become Californian, while also technically part of the United States of America. This is what is going on within the Soviet Union. If members of the Soviet government needed further incentive to act, the KGB chief exhibited the transcript of an eavesdropping conversation on the 29th to the 30th of July among Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Nazarbayev, Nazarbayev being the leader of the Communist Party in Kazakhstan, that named every top USSR official for removal. On the 19th of August, the men who had stood by as Eastern Europe broke away sent tanks rolling into Moscow. Even after becoming General Secretary, Gorbachev, who had never served in the army, had remained wary of the Soviet military and the KGB. Using the pretext of the embarrassing May 1987 landing right behind Red Square of a small Cessna airplane flown from Germany by a teenager, he cleaned house, thoroughly purging the senior army ranks and promoting the obscure Dmitry Yazov, again shown here, to defense minister. In 1988, and again this is consistent with Gorbachev, eliminating any potential rivals by appointing obscure and inexperienced figures to high government positions. He transferred into that emasculated body of KGB chief Chebikov, who had been making public noises about the downside of reform. The new KGB chief, Kryakov, later wrote that at the same time he saw Gorbachev, the man responsible for fulfilling his lifelong ambition to head the KGB, as a hard-working leader who deserved full support. In August of 1991, however, Kryakov, pulling along Yazov, confined Gorbachev at the Crimean dacha and led a group that invoked the Emergency Powers Parliament had sometime been granted to the Soviet president. Announcing its existence on the 19th of August 1991, the State Emergency Committee claimed 8 members after some had asked that their names be kept off the decrees. Their stated goal was to uphold the laws and integrity of the Union, restore labor discipline, cut prices, allocate money to schools, hospitals, and pensioners. They got expressions of support from many provincial officers around Russia. They sent out instructions to local branches of the KGB and Interior Ministry to fight a war on crime. They instituted a naval blockade of the Baltic republics and moved armored troops into Leningrad, a bastion of the Democrats, as well as into Moscow. And this is almost irrespective of the phenomena that is represented by Gorbachev. Leningrad had always represented a rival castle to Moscow in terms of the makeup of the Communist Party. But the committee also took pains to appear to adhere to the Soviet constitution. It was nominally headed by the next in line of succession, the vice president, though some had hoped the lead would go to the supposedly more resolute minister, Valentin Pavlov. After signing on as the country's new leader, Yanev went home to drink. Pavlov also took to drinking and then summoned medical assistance. Troop deployments were poorly coordinated among the various ministries involved, but also timid. The chief of the Soviet ground forces flew to Ukraine, where there 700,000 Soviet troops and officers sworn to loyalty to the high command in Moscow. The general suggested introducing martial law in the Ukrainian Republic, the prerogative of a Republican legislature, but the chairman of the Ukrainian parliament said it was not necessary, and the commander simply departed for Moscow. Russian President Yeltsin managed to fly from Kazakhstan, land at the main government airport in Moscow, drive to his dacha, and then, although KGB troops had surrounded his dacha, ride from there with a small guard to the Russian White House, site of the Russian Republican government. At this richly symbolic site, the Russian leader rallied a corps of defiant officials and civilians and issued decrees that countermanded those of the Russian putschists. Crack commandos positioned outside the Russian White House never received a firm order to storm the lightly guarded building. Their officers entered into contact with Yeltsin. Perhaps nothing did more to undermine the Gang of Eight, as they were called, than the fact that they organized a televised press conference and submitted to unscripted questions. Yanovev fumbled and appeared to be drunk. Not only Pavlov, but Yazov and Krukov were absent. Failing to use the state media effectively, the committee also allowed Western TV journalists to operate freely. At Soviet television, some staff defiantly showed footage of street resistance in Moscow and Leningrad, letting the whole country see what the various layers of the KGB, military establishment ministries, and party machine already knew from CNN. Not even key telephones were cut off. From inside the Russian White House, the chief of Yeltsin's newly created Russian Republic KGB was on the telephone non-stop, talking with commanders in the Moscow military district, with MVD forces, with KGB units. According to one eyewitness, he was telling everyone roughly the same thing. I'm calling at Yeltsin's behest. Don't get tangled up in this business. Keep your men and material out of it. The general whom Yeltsin appointed as Russian Republic defense minister did the same. One Russian commentator has noted, the second echelon of power stood aside. So did most of the first, despite their sympathies with the goal of saving the Union. Leonov, the KGB's chief analyst, writes that among the senior generals there was disquiet, indecisiveness, disorder, adding that he knew the putsch was doomed the minute he saw its televised press conference. Another high-ranking KGB official remarked bitterly, cowardly geezers who were good for nothing got together, and I fell in with them like a chicken into the plucker. The committee's secret list of individuals to be incarcerated counted 70 names, mostly the high-profile Democrats, whom the putschists despised. In the event, just 5 people were taken into custody. For those inclined to emphasize the ruthlessness of the plotters, considered that the vice president had been using Beria's old Kremlin office and Pavlov had been using Stalin's. As late as Sunday the 18th, Defense Minister Yazov, when asked by the conspirators about the next step, had exploded, "We have absolutely no plan." So, as the end of the Soviet Union is a farce, so it just so happens that the attempt to rescue the Soviet Union is a farce. And you can almost say, weirdly, that this is a success of Gorbachev, because the figures responsible for the coup are Gorbachev appointees. They are the result of Gorbachev's refashioning of the Politburo and the top echelons of the government and the army to effectively rely on the indispensability of Gorbachev, despite Gorbachev's idealism and his, you can say, departure from reality when it comes to the end of the Soviet Empire, him unable to arrest that process or do anything. So he is appointed incompetents, and now those same incompetents are responsible for creating the putsch against Gorbachev. So it's only appropriate that the one figure who he is not responsible for appointing, Boris Yeltsin, is the only effective actor in this. Boris Yeltsin is the one who confounds the coup. And in the process, Boris Yeltsin has afforded himself and the new burgeoning Russia power base, the sovereign Russia within the Soviet Union, a formal legitimacy to disband with the Soviet Union and assume power for Russia outside the Soviet Union, outside the concept of Marxism-Leninism, dooming the entire Leninist project. Maybe you considered that ironic, but there we are. All of these creatures are essentially of Gorbachev's design, both the plotters and the man who had put down the coup, while Gorbachev's own authority had completely dissipated as a result of the coup. Again, another irony, the coup plotters, despite their ineptitude, genuinely believed they were saving the Soviet Union. All this does is increase the power of the local republics, demonize and delegitimize the Communist Party and the Soviet army, energize the forces of quote unquote democracy behind Boris Yeltsin. And in a few months, the leaders of Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and of course Russia signed the creation of the Commonwealth of Independent States. The Commonwealth of Independent States was supposed to effectively supersede that of the Soviet Union. And a few days later, already institutions like the Supreme Soviet had failed effectively to come out and um, oppose the plot. And Gorbachev responds by disbanding that institution. Effectively, the only viable institution left within the last few months of the Soviet Union is the presidency itself. But the institutions attached to the presidency are being commandeered by the Russian presidency under Yeltsin. So in the end, the entire Soviet administration has been commandeered by other forces. And simply Gorbachev, when the formal Soviet Union flag is taken down from the Kremlin, has become an irrelevance. His position in power has been made redundant by all of these rival castles that he has created, wants to energize the forces of reform within the Soviet Union, but ultimately end up facilitating its destruction. But that is really not the end of the story of the Soviet Union. At one point, I want to engage counterfactuals. But there is also the point of the continuing destruction of the Soviet Union, because now, under Yeltsin, the Soviet empire or the Soviet state of influence still exists. The Commonwealth of Independent States means that Russia still has some residual influence in Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, and most of the Central Asian Soviet Socialist republics. Areas like the Caucasus and the Baltic republics, most prominently, have completely repudiated the any sort of familial or fraternal ties with the Russian Republic, quite understandably, given the fact that they were forcefully integrated within the Soviet model during the Second World War. But accompanying the the fact that the Soviet Union was superseded by the Commonwealth of Independent States, now we have the process of market reform, and we have the process of privatization. The Russian industrial base progressively begins to collapse. Most of the industry is obsolete. Most of it is sold off virtually for nothing. There is an ongoing feud within Russia itself as to whether the privatized assets should be handed over to Western investors or it should be given over to Russians. But as a consequence, for various concessions, such as Russian assets being handed over to Russians, they were sold off for vastly sort of lower than market value. And as a consequence, we see the creation of the Russian oligarchs. Yeltsin, however, is able to hold on to some basis of power by, like I said, commandeering the facets of the Soviet Union presidency. He augments that position. He creates the office that Putin will ultimately inherit and refine in many ways. There is a war, effectively, between the Soviet parliament, which later becomes the Russian parliament. Boris Yeltsin orders an attack on it and basically neuters it as an organization. And then we have the war in Chechnya. So as a consequence of the stagnation that we see in the 1980s, in the 1990s, it comes to a point of economic collapse. So the question then becomes, why was the Soviet Union's dissolution such a shambles? Why was it such a non-event that it simply almost voted itself out of existence? And this is interesting because it's in stark contrast to what happened in Yugoslavia. In Yugoslavia, there was a nationalistic turn both in Serbia and Croatia. Croatia wanted to seize a large part of Yugoslavia and create an viable independent Croatian state, while Serbia wanted to use the remnant institutions of the Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, the inheritance of Tito, to consolidate the position of Serbs who had, up until that point, been, I wouldn't say marginalized, but they had been truncated within the system of federal Yugoslavia. So Slobodan Milosevic attempted to rejuvenate Yugoslavia by consolidating it around a social nationalism predicated on Serb revanche and integration. When you look at the disposition of the Soviet republics, they were not ethnically homogenous. There was an attempt essentially to consolidate these regions to be homogenous, to represent a Ukrainian, a Belarusian, a Kazakh identity. And yet, if you look at Kazakhstan, I think a third of the population is Russian, still is. When you look at Ukraine, obviously that is an ongoing dispute now. Finally, you can say that we have the Russian revanche in Crimea and the former Novorossiya and Donetsk that was absent in the original disintegration of the Soviet Union. You can say this is belated, and this is a consequence of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, that the original disintegration is now, 30 years later, following in the line of the dissolution of Yugoslavia, albeit it's interesting to see how these events will transpire. But the point I'm making is that Russia did not go, the Soviet Union did not turn to nationalism in 1991. And this doesn't surprise me at all, given Gorbachev's thinking. Gorbachev is fundamentally an anti-nationalist. He is a utopian socialist. He has repudiated even the Stalinist compromise of socialism in one country, it would seem. He is looking for a rejuvenation, not just of democratic socialism in the Soviet Union, a repudiation of the failures, or you can say the, how would I describe it, the atrocities of the Leninist system and the Stalinist system inherited, essentially try to rework the legacy of the revolution from the ground up. And in so doing, perhaps this was the goal, albeit as we see with Gorbachev running around in circles. I don't believe there was an end goal. Perhaps the idea, the utopian vision, was the Soviet Union become relevant in a whole world order which is becoming more actively leftist, rather the Soviet Union almost being an ideological bulwark to inspire as opposed to coerce other nations into cooperation. Again, I'm trying to understand the ideological underpinnings for all of this. But in the end, what Putin has done, conversely, is take the legacy of the Soviet Union and buttress it around an element of Russian revanche and Russian nationalism, something that Gorbachev fundamentally repudiated. Indeed, I believe turning to Russian nationalism would have been one of the only ways of effectively trying to bolster the Soviet Union in its dying days, appealing to the loyalty of the army, shutting down resistance movements, and almost becoming like a situation with Yugoslavia. And maybe that would have resulted in civil war, I don't know, but it's one of the directions that the Soviet Union could have taken in 1990 and 1991 and did not, for the various aforementioned reasons. And as a result of that, the greatest sort of land army in the world was incapable even of preventing the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And we are living with that legacy today. And I think you can understand why I was sort of drawn to this topic, because it does seem in many ways rather inexplicable. And yet I hope that I've been able to find, along with my sort of indebtedness to the historians that I've cited today, a narrative, a historical formula from which to understand the collapse, not only in terms of economic facets, but in terms of politics and ideology. Not simply looking at Gorbachev as something like simplified, like a dynamite thrown into the system, but representing many aspects of the legacy of the October Revolution, all coalescing into a program which resulted in an unmitigated failure and disaster in all respects. Indeed, you can say that Putin represents the final nail in the coffin for Gorbachev's legacy, a return to Russian nationalism, a return to Russia as a great power, and not the realization of a Soviet-led democratic socialism in cooperation with the West. So, indeed, what we see with Russia today is autarky. It's something that the Soviet Union, the Soviet Empire, you can say, benefited from in terms of trying to conceive of this in terms of a nationalistic empire. That the Soviet system and its outer areas, the Soviet satellites, yes, the centrally planned economy was bizarre, but it did have an aspect of autarky. Russia now has regained that aspect of autarky, where you can say it has done that without the dependency upon the absurd, labyrinthine, contradictory nature of the planned economy. So you can say that modern Russia is in many ways more enduring and robust than the Soviet Union was, despite the extensiveness of its empire. Russia is simultaneously smaller than at any time since, Peter the Great? And yet Russia actually seems to be in a far more secure and formidable position than the Soviet Union was in the 1980s. I was referring to earlier that Russia nearly falls apart with these extensive, accelerated programs of reform. It happened with Ivan the Great, with the Oprichnina, and the Time of Troubles, in which Moscow was actually occupied by the Poles in terms of the advancing forces of the West. Sweden nearly attacked Moscow and invaded Ukraine during the Great Northern War under Peter the Great's reign. Alexander II was dealing with the disastrous aftermath of the Crimean War, and Stalin was trying to find consolidating a new identity around communism whilst also appealing to the trappings of the Tsarist system, which had receded as a result of World War I. So maybe the rise of Putin and the failed reform program of Gorbachev is actually following in that similar trajectory of reform, disaster, reconsolidation, and growth. Obviously, I can't say that definitively because historical events are still playing out as we speak, but it is nevertheless interesting to consider. Indeed, I view the Soviet Union as ultimately another expression of Russian imperialism. And I go back to this idea of the Russian Revolution almost representing a form of the Russian Antichrist. It is something that was predicted various times during Russian history. It was a Russian empire, but it was also an anti-Russian empire, as was represented with the figure like Gorbachev. And so what Putin's trying to represent effectively is a melding, a trying to consolidate the idea of a new Russian identity with looking at the Soviet Union as one of these Russian empires, despite, as we have seen, a complete repudiation of nationalism by Gorbachev. All right. I think that is enough. I've been speaking non-stop for the last 3.5 hours, and to be quite frank, I'm amazed that I've done it and I still have my voice. All right. I'll just get to the super chats. Sir Garnet for £5. If you're doing positive reviews of historical films, I would suggest that Outlaw King 2017 about Robert the Bruce could be of interest to you. I'm not sure I have that much of an interest in that period of history, and I mean I'll be prepared to give it a look, Sir Garnet. So thank you for your suggestion. I mean, I almost want these to be older films. You know, I'm thinking of films like The Agony and The Ecstasy and uh, Ludwig and films like that. But maybe I'll try some modern ones. Maybe it'll reinvigorate my hope that not every film that has to be created nowadays has to be a complete and unbridled disaster. One can hope. Lady of Shalott for $5 Australian. Thank you very much. How did these leaders of the USSR feel about Khrushchev and his thaw? Brezhnev had plotted against Khrushchev, but how did Gorbachev view Khrushchev? Gorbachev viewed Khrushchev, along with many of his generation, as basically Gorbachev as a disciple of Khrushchev. Many commenters within Russia saw Gorbachev simply as a second Khrushchev. They didn't realize, however, that Gorbachev was far more idealistic than Khrushchev. Gorbachev had learnt all his lessons from Khrushchev. He was trying to avoid the same political pitfalls, and this accounts for his radicalism in terms of opposing one section of the Soviet system while turning a blind eye to the others. So Gorbachev's relationship with Khrushchev, I believe, is essential in terms of understanding the man, both men really, and hopefully that's come across in my presentation. Enover dos Kafa, thank you very much. I'm not sure what currency that is, but thank you very much. I love your stuff, AM. Have you ever played the game Crisis in the Kremlin, and should Yeltsin be shot? I haven't played Crisis in the Kremlin. Should Yeltsin be shot? Well, Yeltsin's dead, first of all. And if you were to read the memoirs of Gorbachev or watch any of the interviews with Gorbachev, Gorbachev certainly believed that Yeltsin should be shot. Nevertheless, what I find remarkable about Gorbachev is the inability to claim responsibility. Obviously he claims ignorance in hindsight, but Yeltsin was a man created by Gorbachev. So I find it remarkable that he can pin the blame on Yeltsin when Yeltsin's actions are far more politically coherent and understandable than Gorbachev. And to try and give Yeltsin a bit of, cut him a bit of slack, Russia did not disintegrate under Yeltsin. Economically, it dissipated. The corruption was completely endemic. But Yeltsin created a strong Russian presidency that became the bedrock upon which Putin could consolidate Russia. So there is that. And also, Yeltsin had quite a horrific depression. He did try and kill himself, I believe, several times, and he was an alcoholic. So he's a surprisingly complicated man, given the sort of the fact that he's remembered as a rabble rouser and a sort of close to the people populist. Scaddy Warrior, read The Desire for Consumer Goods, something to fill the void from the destruction and decline of religious life, both East and West. Yes, consumerism and materialism is a direct consequence of the decline of religious life. I think there's no doubt about that. However, in the Soviet Union, materialism was explicit state policy, something that's only reared its head in the West recently in terms of the leagues of the militant godless and the persecution of Christianity. That had been the raison d'etre for the Soviet Union. It was the elimination of the vestiges of the opiate of the masses and the creation of a Marxist utopia, which was predicated on the repudiation of a life after death, but rather the realization of utopia on this earth. So in the East, consumerism, ironically, I mean, it's the fundamental sort of inconsistency within Marxism that Marx is almost focused on the dignity of the individual worker and his relationship with craft, the despairing of mass manufacturing, unskilled labor, the death of the artisan, things like this, and that this system would ultimately have to give over, would have to be conceded. But mass consumerism is what the logic of materialism becomes. Because, like I said, there is a weird aspect in the Soviet history, well, not weird, it's actually quite understandable, of heroic anti-materialist materialism. We are building a better future. We are the heroes of the Soviet Union. We are building socialism. We are driving out the invader. All of these things are appearing to religious concepts, but they are not religious concepts. They are pseudo-religious concepts. These are the lingering elements of the Russian Orthodox state that require saints, hence the necropolis and the Kremlin. They require heroes, they require gods, hence the veneration of Lenin into a religion. So, therefore, we can understand the inherent contradictions within the Soviet system. It was, like I said, a Russian anti-empire. It was dependent on Russian history. And so it would aspire to these things, but it couldn't go all the way because of the intellectual stranglehold placed on it by Marxism. Right. At least that's my reading of it. AM, do you think the USSR could be saved after 1984? How should it? Um, Depends how you define saved. Enovostakafa. I don't believe it could have been saved. I believe it could have sort of lingered on. And the Soviets had one of the greatest had the greatest army in the world. It had a massive military-industrial complex. China had proven to some extent that reform with the Communist Party could have been possible, and maybe had Gorbachev been willing to use force, the Soviet Union could have survived. But it's interesting to see, given the democratization of the party, how his legitimacy could have survived, given the economic destitution, because we are seeing the effects of privatization and the opening up of the Russian heavy industry to global market competition. What would have been the effects had the Soviet Union been in power and managed to survive politically? Is it possible that we could have seen the vilification of the Soviet Union doubly because of the economic collapse that ensued in the 1990s had it occurred under the watch of a Soviet president, be it Gorbachev or someone else? So maybe the Soviet Union could have only survived given its autarkic, centrally planned economy. I don't know. And we have the alternative in someone like an Andropov: party discipline, military parity, complete proliferation of the party and the security apparatus into everyone's lives, the demonization and the sort of psychiatric demonization of dissenters and things like that? Or do we have a rotation of septuagenarians like Chernenko and Gromko and Ustinov? It should be noted again in terms of parallels why, again, I was drawn to this topic. Septuagenarian elites, I mean, we shouldn't look at the Soviet Union and not really look at ourselves, because I can't help but draw connections between the septuagenarian elite of the Soviet Union in the 1980s and the octogenarian elite of a certain other power. I'll just leave it there. I mean, it should be self-evident what I'm talking about in terms of sort of late empire vibes on the verge of disintegration. Right. Andrea Christian Mojescu. I don't know what currency that is, but thank you very much. Right. Yep. I think that's it. I've gone for nearly 4 hours, and that's the end of the super chats. Okay. So, like I said, for the rest of the this year, I'm going to be focusing on the Intrusible Chamber, conceptual history, AM reviews, sporadic content like this, which I hope you've enjoyed. And yeah, that's pretty much all I can say. One thing I will point out, obviously I tried to experiment with putting out videos for this channel, having almost done exclusive streaming. I don't really think that's worked out that well. I mean, part of what I enjoy about this process is that I'm speaking off the cuff. I'm reading out and then I'm thinking aloud. And this process helps. It also helps me construe a narrative, and I think it's less intense than my scripted work. I will perhaps periodically put out a video, but far less often. I want to return to this streaming format. And I also want to stream at a regular time. So I hope every week at Friday at 8 p.m. GMT that this will become a regular fixture and people can trickle in and be familiar with this whole setup, because I've been very sporadic as of now, but hopefully as of this year, this will become a consistent fixture. And last point, Chris Seymour, untrustworthy bugman physiognomy on Gorby. Like I said, I picked this picture intently because the image is stupefied. This is a man who, like I said, is the man that runs around in circles and has found himself without a country. And I think this image, for some reason, of Gorbachev, better than all the others, sort of encapsulates that. And on that note, I'm going to say goodnight. Thank you, everyone, for watching.